is everyone ready? I call this meeting to order. Welcome to the joint meeting of the Lompoc City Council and the Lompoc Planning Commission. This is Wednesday, May 30th, 2018. It is 6 p.m. We have roll call, please.
Councilmember Vega.
Here.
Councilmember Starbuck.
Present.
Councilmember Mosby. Present. Mayor Pro Tem Janelle Osborne. Here. Mayor Bob Lingle.
Here.
Commissioner Fink.
Here.
Commissioner Choney.
Here.
Commissioner Leach. Commissioner Gonzalez.
Here.
And Commissioner Rodenhigh.
Here.
Okay, and Brian, did you want to make some opening comments?
Yes, I would. I didn't know if we were going to have the oral communications first before we introduce the item. How would you like to do that?
Well, let's have the oral communication after we do the introductions and whatever else you want to do.
Okay. Yeah, what I'd like to do is just first introduce the item real quickly, and then we'll get into a short, brief power presentation by our consultant, Jennifer Daughtry with Lisa Wise Consulting. I wanted to first just start the meeting by thanking both the City Council and the Planning Commission for being patient with staff. It's been a long road, but at the same time, we've arrived at a point where we're ready to move forward with the project. The council and the planning commission made the zoning or the sign ordinance a priority first, and so that was worked on in 2016, and then in 2017 that was actually adopted and implemented, late 2016, but implemented in 2017. So we're very happy that that part was finished, and that was a priority to do that first. Staff has worked very closely with Lisa Wise Consulting. We have here tonight Jennifer Daughtry and as well as Roger Eastman in the back. They've been integral in this process to get to where we are today. We also have done a lot of reach out to the community because this is not just a city project, but I call it a community project as well. And you'll see some of those people we've been reaching out to and talking to over the phone. The planners have been stepping out of the office and canvassing the city. We've been passing out flyers for both the public comment period and the open house we had in March. We passed out approximately 240 flyers, and we even stepped into some of those businesses, posted those flyers inside those businesses on community boards in various locations because we really wanted to get the word out and tried to publicize this as much as possible. As I mentioned tonight, we're going to start with a brief presentation. And just reminding everyone, the goal tonight is to provide feedback to the consultant and staff so then we can, before we move forward in public hearings, we can kind of get a gauge, so to speak, of changes that might need to be done to the draft before moving forward with public hearings. So that would conclude the brief staff introduction to this item. Sure. And now I'd like to...
Okay, actually, before we read into it, I just have a couple comments and we'll maybe ask Mr. Fink if he has. So I just want to remind everyone, first of all, I want to thank staff for putting this together. And just to remind everyone that the purpose of this meeting is to ensure that we have a document that is readable and is readable and is user-friendly. Okay, we don't want a document that is just a bunch of words that people can't understand. I think we probably have that today. And also this is to ensure that this document will encourage development and make us more business friendly. So that's sort of my goal, and I think it should be our goal this evening, is that this is the outcome of this meeting, that we have a document like that. Mr. Fink, do you have any opening comments?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. My first takeaway from looking through this for the past month or two is I think we've accomplished the goal easier to read, and I think we've accomplished the goal better organized because you can find stuff in here fairly easy. I looked at it from the viewpoint of someone who wanted to do a project, and I tried out a couple of them, and I could figure out what I could do and what I couldn't do. This process can move forward, but if the council makes any dramatic changes tonight to this, then it will probably take them a while to figure out how to incorporate it. So once again, if the goal is to get finished by November November 5th, remember, no government document is ever perfect. And these zoning ordinances can be amended anytime. We process text amendments constantly throughout the year on the Planning Commission because something got forgot or something needs to be changed. So it isn't your last chance to change stuff. We can change it every month if we want to. Finally, I'm encouraged to be here. I'm glad we're working with you, and we'll look forward to any guidance that you have for us so that we can move forward on this document. Thank you.
Okay. Now I'm going to go with oral communication. But before we do that, I want to remind everyone, if you have not already done so, to silence your cell phones. And don't do like I did last time, tell everyone, and I didn't do it myself, so I have mine silenced. So it just take a few minutes to make sure that yours is silenced. And we'll move on to oral communication. This is your opportunity to speak to us for up to 3 minutes on anything that can come before this meeting with the oral or with Planning Commission and or the council. So anyone want to step forward? 3 minutes? Sure, go ahead.
Honorable Member of Council and the Planning Commission. My name is Morris Sobani, 1515 East Chestnut Court. I have very small comments to make about the special district that you have created for downtown areas called downtown specific. What do you call that thing?
The Old Town Commercial?
Downtown, yeah. We have a property at 200 North H Street. Has been vacant for a long time. Used to be a bank building. It was a nice building. That's the only building should not be included in that zone because the rest of the downtown, all the building that downtown area that you have the specific zone for it, do not have parking, no landscaping, no driveway. They are unique to the area that you had provide the special zone. Our property and the property adjacent to us, which is the what they call brewery company and the Bank of America, to me, it's unfair to put them in this zone because we are deprived of using this thing for C1 or C2 commercial. When you put us in that zone, we are limited to businesses who come up here to use that property. Therefore, I request that you consider changing the limit of this thing to Walnut Avenue, and anything north of it should be just a regular zone that you have as Central and H Street. Because we have 80 parking spaces, setback is property, and we have driveway, and we have also drive-through. I don't know if we're going to use that drive-through, but right now, last year we had 2 medical offices, substantial med. We lost them because we could not take advantage of the opportunity we had because the zoning was not there. So I don't see any harm done if you correct that, remove this, anything north of Walnut Avenue. That help us. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Anyone else?
Steve Arrowwood, and I'm with Montemar Winery at 1501 East Chestnut Court. And I've been following the process and put some inputs in, and I know a lot of my friends have done as well. So I just, by the end of tonight, I'd like to know, and I think we were counted up in the brochure, that there were about 78 inputs or so from 12 people. Just wondering if at the end of tonight we'll know how those were handled.
Okay, we'll certainly attempt.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, we're going to close oral communication and bring it back. And Brian, do you want to introduce the new business?
Yeah, I pretty much did an introduction to the item. So if we're ready, we could start that presentation by Lisa Wise Consulting,
Okay.
if I may.
Great.
Good evening. Thank you very much. Once again, my name is Jen Doherty with Lisa Wise Consulting. Thank you, council members, planning commissioners, for having us here and community. As Brian mentioned, I'll go through a relatively brief PowerPoint presentation. I'm going to highlight background, how we got here, key issues, and next steps. As most of you know, the 2030 General Plan was adopted in 2014, and it serves as the overarching policy document for the city. And the zoning code is the primary tool to implement the General Plan. And the General Plan includes policy guidance for land use designations and zones, density appropriate for those zones. The General Plan also includes policies that want to promote revitalization, promote high-quality mixed-use projects, as well as encourage housing and reinvestment. It also includes new zones like the H Street overlay, which we've drafted standards for in the code as well. Some of the objectives for the code, most have already been mentioned. Our objectives are to implement the General Plan that's required by state law. We need to comply with legal requirements as well. And we want a code that's clear, user-friendly, and enforceable. We also want to address stakeholder feedback and comments that have been received. Now, the sign code update has been in place now for over a year and a half, so we are looking at how we can make some tweaks and improve that in this draft. In terms of the process, we started off working with stakeholders, running through a code diagnosis, meaning we identified broad deficiencies with the existing code, and then developed recommendations to address those issues. We had over 6 public workshops, including an online survey related to a key topic, food service in the industrial zones, and then we're able to put that information and analysis together in the draft code you have before you today. We conducted an open house in March, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. A 60-day public review period ran from February 20th to April 20th for this draft. Again, 78 comments received from 12 individuals. Most comments focused on industrial zone uses as well as parking standards. The March 28th open house was scheduled in the middle of that 60-day public review period. We had about 25 attendees with staff and our team available to answer questions and took public comments. It was successful. It was an opportunity where the public could walk around and look at our informational boards that we have here, be able to ask questions in a one-on-one environment instead of in a formal setting, and I think helped engage the public to provide informed comments. So we're going to hit on a few key issues. Those include being user-friendly. As Chair Fink and I believe the mayor mentioned, we have reorganized the code. So the code is intended to be more user-friendly. It includes tables, it includes graphics to illustrate standards. It's also been streamlined. So uses are more flexible. More uses are allowed either by right or with lower levels of permitting, which means fewer conditional use permits or CUPs are required. That means fewer hearings with the Planning Commission, shorter review times. To accomplish that, we provided more options for staff level approvals. So we have minor use permits, administrative use permits that the staff can approve and determine whether or not they need to rise to the level of commission review. Our procedures have also been clarified. So for instance, conditional use permits will no longer be allowed to allow any use that comes forward or allow deviations from standards. The code was also modernized. So uses that are no longer relevant have been eliminated and have been consolidated into uses that allow for flexibility and longevity over time. So there are things we don't know in terms of uses changing over time in the next 10 or 15 years that can be encompassed, for instance, in this example, in terms of general retail rather than specific nuanced uses. Also, the use for bed and breakfasts have been extended to the R1, R2, and R3 zones. That would allow for owner-occupied short-term rentals. Parking standards were mentioned as a key issue in public comment, And the code does propose some more progressive standards for parking. Now, some parking rates are not proposed to change. Parking for general retail remains the same. Parking for wine tasting and production remains the same. However, some uses like restaurant and some office, professional medical office examples where lower parking rates have been proposed, and I think we're hearing some concern about that. So that may be a place where we look to make some modification based on comments we've received. Based on feedback with our workshops, we have made changes to commercial zones, like eliminating the commercial office zone. Properties zoned commercial office would now be zoned planned commercial district. We've incorporated the Old Town specific plan, so that would help to reduce redundancy in terms of duplication and looking into places for standards. And we've also added the H Street overlay consistent with the general plan. The general plan describes policies and measures for Old Town and the H Street overlay in terms of encouraging pedestrian-oriented, comfortable, and attractive commercial areas. And for example, the general plan requires development along H Street to place buildings in front along the street and parking behind. So in terms of standards to implement that, we've included standards for building placement along the street. That's called a build-to requirement, so that buildings along H Street would have to occupy 60% of the lot's frontage along H Street. So I think if the graphic's a little hard to see, we have it up on a board, but for example, this lot along H Street, 60% of the front of that lot would be required to be occupied by a building based on the way the code is drafted now. For buildings located along other streets, it would be a 40% requirement. In addition, Old Town includes a requirement for corners. This would not apply to Old Town, but where along corners the building would have to be located and placed 25 feet within that corner on both sides. Now, these standards, there is flexibility to deviate from these standards based on the way the code is drafted. So if plazas or courtyards or other types of building entrances are designed, you could deviate from these standards. If you need to preserve trees or landscaping, you could deviate from these standards. But this is an example of standards proposed based on the general plan guidance for these areas. Now, the wine ghetto has been a hot topic throughout our process, and the special event overlay is one way we have proposed to address that. We've also addressed it through industrial zone uses. So specifically, restaurants are now allowed, meaning without a conditional use permit, minor use permit, no planning permit required. Restaurants would be allowed in industrial zones, so both I and BP, but limited to 1,000 square feet. Now that proposal reflects the general plan in terms of still wanting to preserve industrial uses and industrial space in our industrial zones. But during staff's analysis, I know we have had some public comments with concern about this, so that's definitely something we're looking for feedback on tonight. In staff's analysis, they did look at the existing site configurations in the industrial zone, I think in particular in the wine ghetto area, and it looks to be that parking will be difficult for these restaurants to comply with, and so that may be a limiting factor regardless of the size cap that may be proposed. Now, the special event overlay would be a new overlay to help facilitate special events, particularly focused in the wine ghetto, but the boundary of that overlay is not set. At this point, we've discussed it relating to the wine ghetto itself, but it could be expanded to include other properties along the wine trail or however the community sees fit, so that's open for discussion. And the special event overlay is also intended to be flexible with outdoor activities. And that leads us into the next slide here on mobile vendors, which includes food trucks, for example. And the way the draft code addresses these now is that it would require a temporary use permit for food trucks approved by staff, so at the staff level, no hearings required. and it would be a 30-day review process max. Those would be allowed in the commercial and mixed-use zones. It looks like we want to make sure we include that in the industrial zones as well. And of course, this wouldn't apply to mobile vendors that would be part of a special event. Special events come forth, they get their own temporary use permit, and any mobile vendor or food truck associated with that event would not be subject to these standards. Those would be approved separately through a special event. But the operational standards proposed in the code now include vending hours, vending between 6 a.m. to 2 a.m., so pretty liberal in terms of hours, dealing with trash, making sure adequate clearance is provided on city sidewalks, as well as separation from things like bus stops, fire hydrants, and ensuring that parking of food trucks wouldn't happen overnight on city streets or sidewalk. In terms of legal compliance, your zoning code is required to comply not only with your general plan, but also with state and federal laws. And the zoning code includes uses reflected in your housing element and state housing law in terms of residential care and other similar uses, codifying inclusionary housing and state density bonus law, and also addresses accessory dwelling units. As many of you know, the state has adopted new standards for ADUs. The code is reflective of that. That requires allowing ADUs in where single-family residences exist in the residential zones with only a building permit and approved in a shortened time frame. So the code now currently is drafted to require owner occupancy of either the ADU or the primary dwelling. That is not a requirement of state law, so that can be discussed. It also allows ADUs in all residential zones except for the mobile home park zone, so that could be discussed as well. Wireless telecommunications, that's regulated by federal law. We have worked with the city's legal counsel to make modifications to those provisions appropriately. Code enforcement, a chapter for enforcing the code, not only the standards in the zoning code, but for conditions of permit approval has been included. That refers to penalties within the existing code, so not establishing new penalties there, but includes certain measures to help to achieve compliance. For instance, permits not being issued to properties with violations unless the permit corrects those violations. Now that would have to be processed within legal framework, and we'd make sure we work with the city attorney to abide by any permit requirements or processing requirements. It also includes the opportunity for recovery of administrative costs, so the staff time in enforcing code issues, as well as the opportunity to charge a reinspection fee if multiple inspections need to go out, if code violations are not corrected readily. So those are opportunities added to the code for your consideration. For next steps, we have not, at this point, gone into the code to address any comments that have been received during the public comment period yet. We're waiting for this work session to be able to provide any final guidance to us before we can make those revisions. Once the code is revised, we'll finalize the environmental impact report addendum, make sure we've dotted our I's and crossed our T's for CEQA, and then we'll move forward with public hearings. So tentatively, we're looking at August and September going to Planning Commission, October, November for Council. So having the zoning code adopted or effective by the end of the year. And that's it for me.
Okay. Before we go to the questions from the council or planning commission, we're going to go a little bit off schedule, and we'll allow if there's any comments based on the presentation from the public. If you have any comments on that before we take. Okay, it's fine. Okay, questions, comments from either the planning commission or the council. And since I don't have lights to see, go back to our school day. Oh, let the records state that Commissioner Leach has joined us now also, so. No, it's okay, okay. So just kind of raise your hand and let me know that you're, yes. Councilmember Sturlbach.
Real quick, an education for me here. you look in here and there's 17.3, what the heck is it here? It's dealing with the sign ordinance again. 17.3.16, we jump back again, 17.6.12 back. There's 3 different sign areas in here. Is there a reason that they're all broke out in here differently? One's enforcement, one's permitting, and one's what's allowable. They couldn't all be done together?
So it is a style preference. The way that it's structured now is to keep procedures together in the procedures division, keep non-conforming together with non-conforming, and then keep the sign standards themselves in the sign chapter. So there is opportunity to move things around. We tend to recommend keeping those procedures in the same place, non-conforming in the same place, sign standards in the same place, to help avoid duplication.
Councilmember Vega, did you have a question?
Yeah, I have several questions. Regarding public comment, I'd like to reference some of these comments here. I think that Mr. Sabani had a point here, and I was wondering maybe if you guys had some feedback that regarding Old Town specific plan on any restrictions that might be validated from his public comment about being an Old Town specific. We're talking about next to the brewery, and in fact, are they restricted from using C1 and C2 as part of their build out? And if we're not prepared to answer, that's fine, but I wanted to at least reference public comment to see if you had any feedback on that, on the positives or negatives of any kind of change there.
Yeah, it's a really good comment. Thank you, Councilman Vega. So I've worked really closely with Mr. Sabani. When I first started with the city, one of his chief complaints was he wanted medical. And I said, wow, it's a very good point. And so as we looked at this code, we actually revised the code to allow medical. So, trying to respond to the development of community as opposed to being very restrictive. So that's addressed in this draft code. As far as the changing the boundaries, I think that would need to be looked into a little bit more, and it'd be interesting to see both commission and council how they feel about that. I think another thing that's come up with Mr. Sabani, but correct me if I'm wrong, is he wants to do a drive-through. And so one of his sites, the old bank site, he wants to do a drive-through. So the drive-through went away, and he's brought up from time to time that he wants to bring the drive-through component back, and drive-throughs are not allowed in the old town. We can definitely discuss that tonight. There could be some issues that we could, but as far as redrawing the boundaries, I think we would need to look at that a little bit further and see how everyone feels about that. That could be more difficult than actually addressing what exactly he's trying to bring to his site,
Gotcha.
As opposed to changing the boundaries.
So because of the time lapse, of the former bank building, I understand everything resets, so you get to look at everything again and rebuild. But under the Old Town specific plan, wasn't the bank, they were allowed to keep the drive-through. Is there any other changes that would have been, except for the lapse of time on a business closing or reopening, that would have that we could use some reasoning on why a drive-through wouldn't be allowed, besides it just being in the Old Town specific plan?
It's primarily the time that surpassed when the use
Gotcha.
is either abandoned or discontinued. And so, yeah, he was, unfortunately, he was, I think you bought the property later, and that's the main issue, not really other areas. It's mainly the drive-through's not allowed in the Old Town. And
So,
if they would have kept using the drive-through, it would have been a legal non-conforming use,
Gotcha.
but it's been gone for quite a long time.
So is there any path to actually reinvigorate that under the existing Old Town, because the bank was using it once upon a time, except for the time frame? Seemed like we can make whatever we need to do happen with a consensus, but I'm asking you for your professional opinion on how we would approach that.
Yeah, one thing that we could consider, and I'm very interested to see what everybody thinks, but one thing that you could do is drive-throughs that have already been built. Mm-hmm. You could write into the regulations to allow those, but not allow any new drive-throughs. So that is one alternative. I would recommend keeping drive-throughs out of the Old Town because it's a very unique area, and if you do want to cater to the pedestrians and you want that Old Town feel, it would probably be good to keep drive-throughs out. But as far as the ones that have already been built, the code could be written, I think, to accommodate that, and I'm interested to see what Jennifer thinks on how to accommodate that, and then we can go around if we'd like to.
Brian, I completely agree with you. I would have some hesitation with adding drive-throughs, whether they're for restaurants or for professional services, as being an allowed use in the Old Town, because I do think that isn't aligned with like the vision and intent for the Old Town area. But I think an opportunity could be for simply zoning the property a different zone, or looking at being creative with the way we draft some non-conforming provisions that really are specific to one case.
No, yeah.
Sure, come on up. Yeah. We're going to go a little bit off.
I'm sorry.
That's okay, go ahead.
I appreciate you allowing me. I then want to address the Old Town zoning. The reason they did not allow, we have to respect the wish of what they did. They were very smart because there's no space available. These buildings are just next to each other, no setback. And so therefore they had a good decision to not allow, you cannot put a drive-through in this building because they're next to each other. Unless somebody buy a whole bunch of these buildings and tear down to some of them and you create that thing, that's a different thing. But as it is, there's no way you could allow, regardless of what the ordinance says, you cannot create a drive-through. Besides, another thing, we have Caltrans have their main highways on those two roads. Truck traffic. I see in this thing here, pedestrian, addressing. I wish we could put pedestrian and people could enjoy walking through. But there's no way anyone could take a risk, and just cross the road. Sure. So these issues, something, but then you go up there to north of Walnut, that condition is different because we have setbacks, plenty of land, parking lot, and I'm just saying that the property north of Walnut is a different setup, and we could easily allow that thing without changing anything in the downtown area.
Okay, well, we'll try to address that then.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
Yes.
One of my suggestions in looking at other municipalities in other cities is a trend and a term that I've heard, and we have actually used it once before, is adaptive reuse. And what that does is allow the adaptive reuse of an existing building. That limits the necessity to go back and change a specific zone or a specific use of each individual buildings, whereas maybe we can incorporate something within the code that says that there is some flexibility in the adaptive reuse of a building. And what that does, it's only an existing building and a feature of that existing building, thereby preventing the addition of that similar thing in new buildings.
Okay, that's good. Yes, Commissioner Leach.
Yes. This issue was brought up before, specifically with the Solvang Brewing Company, because their facility in the Old Town Center doesn't require any parking. And we all knew that if there was no parking attached to it, it would become a big problem, particularly for the residential units on G Street. And the Old Town has no parking requirements because it's anticipated they would use the parking lot that the city owned down there, but it's not realistic to believe that people would park in the parking lot along Cypress and literally walk to the Solvang Brewing Company. So I agree with Mr. Sabani. I think that those kinds of uses for the Old Town Center don't work from Walnut North. And most of those parcels have adequate parking for their uses. So I would certainly think that would be a good answer to some of the future uses that may need to go into those vacant lots there, that it not be under the umbrella of the Old Town Center.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Fink.
Yes, Councilmember Vega asked, how could we do it? And Commissioner Gonzalez suggested including it as adaptive reuse. That's one method of doing it. The other is we could adjust the boundary of the OTC back to Walnut Avenue, and it would have, in my opinion, very little impact on the Old Town Commercial District. You could do that, or you could include a general plan amendment. You know, as we have to do it anyway as part of this process. This zoning ordinance change is going to perpetuate a general plan amendment, so you just roll that up in the general plan amendment for this, and you change the boundaries of the Old Town Commercial District, and that's an efficient way to do it. But I think Commissioner Gonzalez's idea about adaptive reuse is probably the short-term, easiest solution to this individual problem. You know, you have to deal with these things case by case, so.
I'm not sure it's an individual problem. I'm trying to think that area. Isn't Stillman Cleaners? That is an area there.
Well, there's a number of parking lots down there. The theater has one. The old theater has one.
But for the drive-through areas.
Stillman's has one. As he pointed out, the Bank of America has one.
He's talking about the drive-through.
Oh, the drive-throughs, yeah. Well, they have a drive-through window, but
Well,
they have no
I think it'd
canopy.
be argued that that could be a drive-through.
It's
Yeah.
true.
Commissioner Fink, anything else? Before I take your phone away, yes.
My only concern with changing the Old Town Commercial Zone is that Salt Lake Brewing has put a pretty big investment into their property there. If we change Old Town Commercial at this point, if we change that into regular commercial, then wouldn't their no parking required permit go away, and suddenly their business plan become a lot more difficult? If they'd be legal non-conforming, but that is not the same as being a permitted use.
Right.
So I'd hesitate before I jumped into that. I'd almost feel like we kind of snookered somebody into moving into that spot.
Okay. Let's see, Councilman Starbuck first.
Just a comment, in the Old Town specific plan, the only drive-throughs that are prohibited that I'm aware of are drive-through restaurants. That's right in the very beginning of Chapter 3 in the Old Town specific.
Okay.
It's actually, if I could just interject, it's actually any drive-through. It's not specific to a restaurant. It's just drive-throughs. So they weren't trying to single out restaurants.
Reference?
I'll look for it and I'll
I'm
get
on
that to you.
page 3.2, number 2, purpose.
Okay, Councilmember Vega.
Yeah, thank you for the comments. I think that short-term, without infringing on anybody else's rights or benefits, I think that the adaptive reuse of the property would probably be short-term for the consultant and planning to actually make that happen. I mean, this is a heavy-duty building. The bank was constructed like that, and it seems a shame not to use a structure that was built to that caliber, in that area. I believe that probably with Salt Lake Brewery, there was no parking plan required, but I believe they did submit one because, anyway, they just got caught on the short end. I think they had to put one in there, but they weren't required because of the Old Town specific plan. Yeah, he's right there.
Yes.
And going back to the opening statements of Mrs. Daugherty, one of the purposes of the zoning is to facilitate and to spur development. As a finance person in my professional background, one of the most prohibitive items that I've encountered with Old Town is that substantial modifications cost substantial amounts of money. And those modifications then require or pretty much kill a project. Hence why we've seen downtown as many efforts that we've made not really move much. So as much of these types of obstacles that we can remove, we're not trying to address a single person or property, but actually facilitate the economic feasibility of redeveloping OTC.
Okay.
Questions, sir?
Mr. Halverson, have you?
Yeah, there is also another reference regarding banks. It says banks, credit unions, and financial institutions without drive-throughs, but you're correct. There isn't a wholesale prohibition of drive-throughs, but it relates to service uses. So it lists service uses, banks, credit unions, financial institutions, and then that's the Sabani property, although there's been a variety of uses that he's looking into for that property, and then, of course, the restaurant, as you cited.
Councilmember Vega.
Thanks again for your input. Mr. Sabani, if I could ask, and to the Planning Commission and all of us, the drive-through is one aspect of this, but without changing the Old Town specific plan, we don't change any commercial boundaries, so you may still be restricted in some manner of what type of businesses may be able to go into that bank. I'm not sure if that's, you know, the drive-through is one aspect of it, but again, referencing the uses, I guess Brian probably could fill me in a little bit more on if he's going to be able to put, is he going to have that versatility, or is he going to be restricted either way because of where it's at?
Now, one thing please keep in mind, excuse me, am I allowed to?
Sure, go ahead.
Keep in mind, we are very limited in bringing business to this town. One of the major problems I have experienced is here, once in a while we get a business. For instance, 2 years ago we had a, what they call medical facility. They are not available now. It might take another 10 years we get something like that. For instance, Toyota Motor was looking for, they are having problem to find a dealership in Long Island. So this opportunity is not like Santa Barbara or other major cities that they come around all the time. So we have to be very careful to accommodate these tenants when they're available. And we should have flexibility or something that when we get the opportunity, we should not lose that tenant. That is the problem I'm experiencing, and most of the other developers have the same problem. We are not that lucky to have that many tenants. So when the tenant comes in, we should have a vehicle or a method that when I come to the Planning Commission or to the Planning Department, they should, hey, I've been faced with deadlock of this. Oh, the zoning doesn't allow you, so you lost it. And that might take another 5 years. So please keep that in mind and help us out to work with us when we have a tenant. So the only way I could see, if we could, I could see downtown specific, you know, from H Street, from Ocean Avenue to Walnut, because of the layout of the building limits us to have many opportunities. For instance, that gentleman who bought that Newspress building, he is tearing down the building, put parking lot in the building. So that he's a clever way he did it. But not many other people can do that. So what I'm saying, area north of Walnut Avenue is a different situation. We have parking spaces, so give us an opportunity to find tenant and don't restrict us.
Okay, let's try to find, yes.
I wanted to, I guess, look at this issue from kind of the opposite standpoint and kind of warn also, you know, Mr. Sobani that flexibility or the opposite of flexibility could be a double-edged sword, because right now you have the opportunity to do with that space, and by space I mean with that lot, meaning building and the parking around the building, really you have the opportunity to use that as you see fit. What if someone wants to come in and is more interested in the whole size of the lot and wanting to actually build a bigger building because they can now, because they don't need the parking, and then if we move the OTC borders south of Walnut, then that opportunity cannot materialize, because then you're restricted in having the parking around the building. So I think there's also, you know, another aspect, like the opposite aspect that you have to consider, that right now that lot, you could tear down that building and build a whole apartment unit without having, if someone is interested in buying your lot, right, without having to deal with the parking. So, two faces of the same
Quick
metal.
answer. But 25 years, this zoning has been there, and this past 25 years killed that area. So we have experienced that this is not that opportunity, that we have lost all opportunity. All the downtown businesses are gone because we did not anticipate this happening. All I'm saying, hey, what would happen if, all I'm trying to say, every now and then we get a good tenant. We should not lose that tenant just because we have a restricted zoning ordinance. And to me, we should, this is an extraordinary condition, and we should take the past experience and create a vehicle that we will not fall in that trap again.
Okay, I think we're spending a lot of time, oh, go ahead.
I don't get to talk about Old Town very often, so I'd like to take advantage of this for a few seconds. I understand, and a few years ago, we had a big discussion with this. I'd like to throw in there now, when you want to talk about inconsistencies with Old Town, there was talk of retracting from F to G Street. Here he goes, why? Well, the reason was, if you look at the Old Town specific plan, it prohibits car dealers. What's between F and G? Toyota. So here again, Toyota has been afraid, I understand, not talking to the new owner. Why do they want to upgrade their dealership when they're not zoned to be there in the first place? So there is sometimes the change from 2000 till now, it might need to be looked at. I'm done.
Okay. Does anyone, we spent quite a bit of time on this issue, does anyone want to recommend a compromise, a solution?
Absolutely.
Councilmember Vega.
With a consensus from everyone and with their input as far as for that specific building, I think that we should actually look at the adaptive reuse of the existing building. I like your recommendation, and the rest of you on Planning Commission. I think short term, I think hopefully we can all agree that that would probably be the best vehicle to allow him to have more opportunity, and so that we can make sure all the missed opportunities are not passing us by right now. I think that we have that opportunity to make those changes. So I think that would probably be my recommendation, unless somebody else has some input on that.
Any other input? Okay, so let's get a second on this, and we can. Oh.
Yes, ma'am.
Could I just clarify something? Are we looking at just that site, or is there a consensus on revising the boundary for the Old Town commercial area?
I don't think you need to, at this point, do a boundary redesign at the moment. I think that's something that we could evaluate after the zoning plan's put in place, because it's a different question. And having been, as I was sharing with some individuals when they were passing around the map, while on the Economic Development Committee, we did look at multiple ways to rezone that area and decide whether or not what streets were still truly Old Town and what might not be. And so that's a much longer discussion that I think should be put aside until after we've dealt with this larger document that I think is far more important as a whole. Having said that, I will give Victor the second regarding the adaptive reuse. And I think for this property in particular, yes, but if there's any other contingencies within the area that there be phrasing that allows for it, such as the automotive location and that sort of thing, because we do have some outliers that have been grandfathered in. So allowing adaptive reuse if, say, Toyota didn't want to be there, but the only other person who wanted to come in was another dealership, that we shouldn't shy away from that being available by having adaptive reuse for more than one location within Old Town. Good with that?
Yes, ma'am.
And just one additional thing with the understanding to be that the biggest problem is the lack of use of a particular building, so that we can get away from that, so that because you just don't have a tenant in a certain period of time, that use is lost.
Councilmember Vega?
No, I'm good.
Okay, so, Jeff, do we do a formal vote on this, or did you just have a consensus? How do we do
I don't
this?
think we needed to have formal votes, but maybe we could just have thirds like we do
Sure.
when we're adding items to agendas.
Okay, now is this just from the council, or do we want to get, authorization from the planning commission as well.
I think since the council is going to be the ultimate decider on this,
Okay.
it should be just the council tonight.
Okay, so does Councilmember Vega have a third?
Read the specifics on this back, please.
I'm gonna let you know. The adaptive reuse for the area.
The recommendation was to create a term and a definition of adaptive reuse for buildings within the Old Town zone so that they could be either utilized for something that was historically and very specific, or not lose out on an opportunity for a building that may have been restrictive and now has a new idea that isn't exactly called out in Old Town zoning. Did I get that right, Nick?
I'm going to recuse.
Okay, so I'll give a third on that. So you've got the majority of the city council that has approved that. Is that clear?
Yeah, I think it is clear, but one thing I wanted to just express that I think the way that we would address this is simply modifying the non-conforming section in the code to address exactly this that we're talking about, the verbiage and the instances where you have uses that were allowed at one time, it was discontinued, but yet even though the 6 months has surpassed, it could come back. And I've seen that done before with other codes, so I think that's kind of the charge, and I think we hear you loud and clear. Okay. Especially for some of these uses that could go away, like Toyota, and for someone to come back. I will say this, I've worked very close with Toyota, and they don't want to be in the location that they are. They want to find a very large site, but of course, when they go away, it sounds like both the commission and the council would like another auto dealership if someone wanted to go in there.
Well, we probably all may or may not have heard, but if Toyota moves from that location, the RV, Pacific Coast RV, would love to have that location. That's a similar type of business, so. It's Commissioner Fink.
Okay, I'm going to ask a question. Now that we have direction from the council, is there any way to expedite this one use for Mr. Sabani? Now that we know what we're going to do you think that we can kind of move it along a little bit so he can get a project in there?
What we'll do is, I've got a pretty good relationship here with Mr. Sabani, so I will be calling him and discussing this, and we can certainly work with him on trying to get that before the Planning Commission City Council, rather than waiting for the zoning ordinance update. Is that correct? Is that what you'd like to see it come before the zoning ordinance, or do you want to wait to see everything together?
I think expedite it.
Expedite, okay.
Councilmember Mosby.
Okay, at our next meeting, we're going to have his hearing, right?
Councilmember Mosby.
Yeah, I as well spoke with Toyota, and I got a different story than what you guys got. Because Toyota would like to stay where they are. They'd like to expand where they are. And they're having difficulties because they seem to be feeling like they're being pushed out of there. And I think it'd be crazy to chase probably the most successful is financially wise business out of Old Town. And it does bring in a lot of people in. So they just called me last week asking if there was a way to find more land available because they would like to expand. They would like to go all the way to the corner lot. They would like the lots behind that used to be where the county ag department was as well. So, I mean, they would like to stay. They understand what it takes to put a parking lot in somewhere else. And they are content with where they are, but they would like to have, like, the old Ford dealership overflow parking lot. They'd like to have the ability to use that it was designed and built for, which was a parking lot for automobile sales. And I guess they approached the gentleman to try to purchase that at one time, and they were told that they couldn't use it what it was designed and built for. So, you know, pushing Toyota, I don't know where they're going to go, but I hate to push them too hard and have them leave Lompoc. But their comments and discussion with me is they'd like to stay where they are and they'd like to expand where they are.
Okay. Anyone else on this issue? Success on that, okay. Okay. Other issues that we want to address?
I'd like to address. We got public comment.
Sure, okay.
So can we move on?
Council member, we'll go with Councilmember Vega.
Let's move on here to the wine ghetto area. I'd like to bring up this fact that we had public comment here. We have Mr. Arrowwood here. Not exactly sure exactly where his direction is, but I'm going to bring up from the consultant and from Planning Commission the restaurant and restrictive parking for that. If you guys could address that and give us a couple of alternatives on what we can do. It seems like it's a little restrictive if the actual restaurant is put in there as far as parking. So if you guys could maybe address that a little bit and let us know what the alternatives were, because I believe your comment was that the parking could be restrictive if they were to move forward with a restaurant in the ghetto.
Councilman Vega, staff has looked at this area and looked at all the spaces in the wine ghetto and did some theoretical calculations if a certain amount of restaurant space was installed in those areas. And so because it was designed and built as an industrial park, it never anticipated these public-oriented uses. And so I have worked with Mr. Arrowhead, and he came up with something. Instead of doing a restriction of 1,000 square feet, he wanted to just create, and that hasn't been, I think, vetted out yet, a total square footage that the whole area would be limited to. It's not a bad idea, but I think mostly I'm always hearing from commission and council that we need more parking, we need more parking. We don't want parking to spill over into neighboring properties. Staff is totally supportive to bring restaurants in that area, but we also want to caution decision makers to know that we will have a parking problem because it wasn't designed and built as a area catered to the general public. And so we have to be careful on the cap, of course, the utilities. We've gone on and discussed, but parking is very, very challenging. I mean, everything we looked at, even I think Greg Stone's looked at an analysis, even things 300 to 500 square feet of a restaurant space would create deficiencies in parking out there. And so it's just got to be accepted by the city that they're going to have parking impacts out there, knowing that the advantage is economic development of people coming to that area and visiting that area. I know in Santa Barbara, they basically accepted that. They accepted that parking problem where there just isn't a lot of parking in the funk zone. They park in front of warehouses and things like that and on the street. So it's
so the versatility from your end is to know that's going to be restrictive. And the street that's right behind Home Depot, is that incorporated in off-street parking as part of anybody's plan as far as for the wine tasting area in the ghetto? There is a street that's just isolated there that I'm sure people off-street, it's not a main thoroughfare, it just goes right through the ghetto, or it's on the side of the ghetto, which is right across from the Stodovich Winery right there, right across the street. I'm just wondering if that's another opportunity, or if Mr. Arrowwood might even know if that's where people park anyway, or does it ever get congested, or does it ever... is it ever full back there because of the actual parking lot area having an overflow?
We're looking at that area on our computer screen right now. Obviously, parking requirements on the street can't be used to qualify for parking. So I'm looking at the aerial photograph right now, and are you talking about it's actually inside the Sabani Industrial Park? Or are you talking about across the street?
I think he's talking about 12th.
12th Street, yes,
Right.
I believe.
But on the street, not on private property.
It's on the street. It's actually, and it may not even be 12th Street. What is that cross street that's going right in the middle of the ghetto?
There's an east-west street that runs right off
Is
of
that
12.
9th Street, okay. Yeah, and I'm just wondering if there's a use for, obviously he just mentioned that he can't use that as part of the parking plan, but obviously it is parking, because if you looked at it like Old Town specific, without a parking plan, you would use off-street, or you wouldn't even count it as, you wouldn't count it against the business. So I guess our mentality probably needs to expand a little bit, and we're using for legal non-conforming type aspects here in these areas.
Go ahead, Commissioner.
One thing that we may entertain that we have not done previously is that parking impacts are mitigated in other municipalities with parking permits in certain areas. So you could go to the area immediately around 7th Street and issue permits, and it's added additional sign to an existing post that restricts the hours or requires a permit during certain hours of uses, thereby negating the neighborhood impact of that adjacent use, and that puts the burden back on the users in their area and not upon the residents in the surrounding area.
Commissioner Fink.
Right. Before you make a decision about whether we should or shouldn't on the restaurants in the wine ghetto, I would urge you to take a trip 15 miles east to Buellton. And in their industrial area over there, have a very successful restaurant in an industrial area similar to the Sabani complex. Try to park there during lunch or try to park there in the evening, and it's almost impossible because the other businesses there are very successful and they have their employees parking in there and their customers, so there's very, very little parking available, almost none when you go over there. If you try to park on the street is also occupied with cars, so you wind up, if you really want to go there, you gotta walk a couple of blocks to get to it. So I think before we just slough off the parking issue, we should look at an actual in-use project to see how it is impacted. And, you know, whether you do or you don't is really kind of irrelevant. Now, as far as off-street park or on-street parking goes, as part of the parking situation, when we just put in the hotel there at Barton and H, we actually discussed the availability of on-street parking as part of the overflow ability for that project. So I think that they come up shy a couple of spaces on parking, so we said, well, you know, we've looked at that street. In the evening hours, there's very little parking on the street, so we considered it as part of our consideration. So could we consider it? We have in the past. Whether or not this commission or future commissions would look favorably on that, don't know. But once again, the ultimate decision is yours to tell us what to do.
Yeah, just for clarification, the street that I'm actually talking about is an east and west street right behind Home Depot. Somebody mentioned 9th, but I don't believe it's 9th, okay?
There's a street back there between the electrical substation and the...
Okay.
I think that's Industrial Way.
Come up to the microphone if you want to talk.
But there is a street back there,
Are you
yeah.
talking about right behind Home Depot?
Yes, ma'am.
That belongs to Home Depot.
Right, well, not, it's on the other side of the ghetto, okay? It's right on the other side of the wine ghetto.
Just to the
street's
north,
going
right?
to it, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a street that's very low traffic from what I've seen, and I don't know whether that ever gets full at all, you know? I don't think so, but I think
Yeah, I've never
it's
seen
basically a
anybody there.
great place.
Okay,
For
so-
clarity, based on Google, that is North 9th.
North 9th.
Okay,
Wow,
so I want to remind everyone, we are recording this, probably mainly for dictation, is that correct? So if you're speaking, speak into the microphone, and only one person speak at a time, so we can sort of understand what's going on.
Again, my usual 2 cents about parking. I agree that there needs to be a study, just like Chair Fink has mentioned. But again, I would like to urge the City Council to not let parking get in the way of economic development. Let's not pay the opportunity cost of losing some potential huge economic benefits just because parking gets in the way. People find a way to park. Industrial Way might be in Buellton, might be full of cars, but that doesn't mean that the business are not successful. In fact, Chair Fink himself said the restaurant is so successful that people don't know where to park. I think that just speaks for itself.
Thank you.
And a similar restaurant out in there in Buellton, Lompoc Bistro. It's a small little industrial area. Very little parking, but they seem to be successful as well, so. Okay, yes.
Before we come to a determination on the parking, I really think that we need to have some discussion with the wine industry itself, because if you have a restaurant in there and it's taking up more parking places than, you know, than normally would, obviously you're going to have a lack of parking for the wineries. So I think there needs to be, amongst the people, the businesses who are in that area, they need to have a discussion about what's important to them. Do they want a restaurant that's going to take up their parking, or would they like food trucks to come? You know, there's some options there that they might prefer and might work better for their businesses.
Yeah, and I agree with you, with one exception. We only have one winery here this evening, and this is something that upsets me all the time, that people that want to have input don't show up at these meetings. And so if we happen to, and Commissioner Leach, I completely agree with you, but they've had the opportunity to be here to voice their opinion, and right now, if we make a decision that upsets them, shame on them, not shame on us. So let me get the speaker, and then I'll come back to you.
On the wine industry, we circulated and just discussed how to get the best input in, and so those 12 inputs were not really, there's not 12. The wine industry gave one input, and I believe there was between 18 and 20 people that said these 3 pages of input are from all of us. So in this time, it was not every winery in the city, but it was the vast majority of the wineries in the ghetto. And I think that anyone who had a different opinion would have submitted something separately, and maybe they did. But most of the wineries did submit that, and they want wineries. They want restaurants, because you should go to Buellton. It's busy, but ask the people running the city if they're happy. Ask the hotels if they're happy. Ask La Botte, these other restaurants are happy because people coming from all over the country to go to industrial eats, and many of them don't go because it's too busy. And so they've overflow, they're sleeping in Lompoc, or they're sleeping in Buellton, and they're getting there once, hopefully for the weekend, but they're going to the rest of the whole town. And they're drinking wine, and they're doing everything else there too. So, okay. And that's Industrial Way, the east-west one that then curves into 9th.
Okay, thank you.
And just to reiterate maybe a few points that was just made, initially when they came to the Planning Commission, some of my other commissioners can concur, I had taken a tally, and at that time it seemed to be like equally split 3 ways. 30% wanted one thing, another 30% wanted something different, and the final 30% wanted something else. And interchanging with them, we encouraged them to come back with a consensus. And my interpretation is the letter that was submitted was some type of consensus from what I perceive to be a majority of the individuals, or at least were in that immediate wine ghetto that we're discussing, if that's any consolation. Thank you.
Go ahead, if
Yes,
you're ready.
Commissioner Rodenheim.
If you want to. Go ahead.
I think one of the things that we've felt here in town for a long time is that we'd love to have a parking problem. You know, we would love the Albertson Shopping Center to be like Loretta Plaza in Santa Barbara. We'd love people to come in here and say, oh, I couldn't find a parking space, so I had to come back. You know, if we had that kind of market going on, we'd figure out how to cope with it. And the way that we'd cope with it would be that the economy here would start thriving a lot more than it has. We've had 30 or 40 years of having plenty of parking, and it's not working very well.
Thank you. Oh, okay.
Just a real quick comment too. When you look at it, we're looking at 1,000 square foot. We're talking about a 100 by 100 smaller. The parking and seating in there is not going to be an impact. I don't even see a restaurant coming in 1,000 square foot. I mean, the kitchen possibly, but one. Itty bitty.
Okay, I'm going to get Janelle, then I'll come to you. Okay, Councilmember Osborne.
So I agree with Commissioner Rodenheim that it would be lovely to have a parking problem. I will say that all of my conversations with the wineries is that the consensus is they would like to have food present in the ghetto. So providing an opportunity for that to happen in any of our industrial zones is another opportunity for potential growth, because there are locations both in Santa Barbara and Paso Robles and different areas where things like the Funk Zone or the 10 City have drawn tourism, but there's also industrial spaces where having a lunch counter, it helps those that are employed in the area grab a quick lunch, meet with clients not in the atmosphere, and so making sure that our industrial areas have the ability to have food at some level present so that we don't lose out on that opportunity to maintain a presence either from tourism or from those businesses is what we're looking at. So for me, it's let's give this a chance. This is a good experiment to figure out if it works. And as Commissioner Fink has said, this document is much easier to change. And so if we're seeing an impact, if we're seeing a complaint from the neighborhoods, if we need to put signs up regarding limited parking, we can do that. But until we actually make progress and see if it works, it's tons of what-ifs. So again, I think we move forward on this concept, we deal with potential fallout of parking, and if we have an issue, we address it, because we'll find out. This community is very good at telling us when we have a problem. So.
Councilmember Mosby.
Yeah, no business is stronger than its weakest link. And if its weakest link is an overflow of parking everywhere, you will affect the business. Two businesses have recently opened up. You have Solving Brew, and probably one of the #1 complaints in the neighborhood is they're tired of the people parking and their overflow parking onto the street. People are getting out at 10, 11 o'clock at night in front of their cars. They're arguing in front of their cars and talking to the people who live in those areas. They are not happy. And that's probably one of the largest complaints that's happening with Solving Brew is that the vehicle parking is coming up on the neighborhoods. And one of the reasons why we are here is when we make moves, that we don't make moves that are impacts, or minimal impacts upon the neighborhoods. You don't wait until it's already happening and people are yelling and screaming at us. You don't need to do that. That's why we've studied it and we have plans. The other one here, when you talk to at the Chop House, one of the difficulties he's having when he was having his lunch was he was so restrictive with the parking that he had. He has 17 places. You have 5 employees, you have 12 places for customers to come. Very difficult to get there. You're already in an impacted neighborhood. We used to be able to park on Ocean Avenue. I remember that. That got taken away. You don't park on Ocean Avenue anymore. But you have neighborhoods around there. And those people are there during the day. Their cars are blocking there. The Chop House would have difficulty running a lunch business there. Parking was an issue. He's been able to negotiate the movement and the use of the parking lot to the west of him, which closes at 5 o'clock, the business does, so he has surplus parking. Because of that, it has relieved the issue of parking so people are able to make it there and fill up his tables. Parking is very important so you don't have neighborhood impacts. I've seen it all the way around, and you will hurt it financially, and you can't think that we're Santa Barbara. Santa Barbara has a lot of other variables that are bringing money to the town, and you don't want to be. I know, Mr. Rodenheim, wasn't long ago, you were concerned about the parking around your business because there was conflicts with the neighbor on the other side, and if everybody's everywhere, it's a mess, and we're not in that position that we can really grow accustomed to that. Because people will go somewhere else where there isn't a parking problem. You go to State Street in Santa Barbara, there's a parking problem for blocks all the way around. And that's why people are forced into accepting it. Here, if people have to have a parking problem, they're just going to go somewhere else where there isn't a parking problem. That's what's going to happen. So it's very important to not affect neighborhoods, and it's very important to not impact the business you think you're trying to help.
Okay, Councilmember Vega.
Actually, on the other end, I think that we should think globally as a community that we want to be business friendly in certain aspects, because what we're talking about is the industrial areas, and we're talking about the areas where we could have economic development for these businesses. The businesses community need our help. They absolutely do need our help, and I would love that problem that such as industrial eats. I think that if we look at the whole city, we're counting on maybe 1 or 2 areas, but I think a lot of times that little versatility that we can use off-street parking to maybe add a couple of that gray area where someone maybe might not be compliant. Mr. Fink, I'm not sure how your thought process is on this, but and all of you, that we use that versatility to help our city actually be business friendly. I don't think Lompoc, with the spaces that are vacant, And especially with the Sabani property and other properties like that, we have the opportunity to entice other people to come in here and offer them a relative measure of success here. People just don't open a business so they can fail. So I think we have to actually let them have that latitude to use that. So, Mr. Sioni, so I would rather have us go toward that direction.
Okay, Commissioner Sioni.
Okay, so a car is what? Maybe 10, 15 times bigger than a person? How can you sustain an economy on the basis that there should be one parking spot per customer? It is impossible, physically impossible, unless you're the size of LA. Okay, so the concept that if a restaurant has 15, can serve 15 people, there needs to be 15 parking spots, is just mathematically, geometrically doesn't make any sense. So we need to reason differently. We need to let the businesses open and then figure out, the customers will figure out how to carpool, the customers will figure out how to park, the customers will figure out how to walk, the customers will figure out how to take bus shuttles. This is how cities, modern cities are moving forward. And Santa Barbara has a big parking problem. Nobody gets away from Santa Barbara. Industrial Way in Buellton has a big parking problem. People still flood there. The concept of having one parking spot per customer is just impossible.
Could I make a suggestion? Would the council and commission want to direct staff to put into the zoning ordinance allowing on-street parking to meet the parking requirements? Our consultant reminded me that we had it drafted in our code at one point, and it's not in there. So hearing this discussion, would that be something that you want to direct staff to put back into the draft zoning ordinance to allow
I think that's certainly
on-street?
something we should be discussing, but let me get the comments from Mr. Fink, and then, did you have one else, Mr. Gonzalez? Oh, okay. Mr. Fink.
Okay, you asked me, what my thought process was about parking. Well, I don't know, Commissioner Roden and I and Commissioner Gonzalez have been on the Planning Commission for a long time, and my thought process is we can't wave a magic wand and solve the parking problem. Every time we have a project, we talk about parking. Every time we try to adjust or accommodate or do something, there is no magic wand for parking, and I think perhaps Brian's suggestion of including on-street parking is a way to help with the calculations. There's 50 ways from Sunday to figure out parking, and we've tried a lot of them. I think we've probably tried 48 of them, and sometimes it works and sometimes it don't. If you talk to the Solvang Brewery owner, he objected to providing parking in the vacant portion of his property, and we said, I think you're going to be happy you have that parking space and want more. And according to Councilmember Mosby, that's exactly what he needs, more. Okay, well, maybe the next guy that puts in a business won't need quite as much. So once again, I don't think there's a magic wand for parking.
Yes, Commissioner.
Lompoc is not Santa Barbara. You know, the reason the funk zone works is because a lot of people live there and live around it, and a lot of tourists come into Santa Barbara, and that's why it works. We don't have the tourist base, even with the ghetto there. We don't have the walkability in this community, and that's not a location that's real walkable to get across town to. We don't draw the citizens of Lompoc out there like Santa Barbara draws its citizens out and its tourists out. So I think that we're not being realistic about parking, even though I do agree with Freddie. You just can't base it on singular parking places for your source of clientele. However, isn't there a joint parking agreement set up there in the ghetto? So couldn't it become a joint parking agreement, kind of like the one out in Flower Valley Plaza? Is that what it's called? Where they all share parking, because as many times as I've gone by there, and I probably go to Home Depot twice a day, there's always available parking in the wine ghetto. So to me, there's definitely room for more business growth because the existing businesses are not utilizing all of the parking. So if there was a shared parking agreement throughout the complex, that would probably help in a lot of ways. And I don't know if there is one there or not.
Well, Commissioner Leach, I agree with you 100% because most people that go there, if they drive there, they park and then they walk from tasting room to tasting room. They don't drive to tasting room.
Right.
So if you have tasting room A, the parking space you have may be from customers that just came from the one down the street, so, or down around the corner. So I agree with you that it should be shared, yeah. I like the idea of possibly putting back in street parking, allowing street parking in there. So do I have a recommendation from the council?
I'll make that recommendation that we include off-street parking and possibly maybe we can look into a joint parking agreement. I think that's an excellent point there. I also would like to mention something. Somebody might throw me under the bus here. Someday, you know, Santa Barbara has turned their parking situation into a revenue-generating entity, which basically it's high impact there, and the density is so rough. But if you go back and you look, once upon a time, if we want to change we get enough business here and people are attracted here and businesses are successful. If you look back at the old pictures in Lompoc of the 50s and 60s, there once upon a time used to be parking meters on these streets for off-street parking. It may be old school, but in Santa Barbara it happens. But if you go back and you look at some of the historic pictures in Lompoc, right on Ocean Avenue, there were parking meters once upon a time. So it could turn into something that could be revenue generating by expanding the business opportunities and minimizing the missed opportunities for businesses. Will people come to Lompoc and are willing, they pay for parking? I think that Mr. Arrowwood, I think probably the parking situation where there's too many people there, yes, they're going to expand into Lompoc, but if you look at the whole community as a whole, I think all of us have experienced when one restaurant's too busy, we're not going to wait in line and we're going to go somewhere else. So I don't know that that's changed because we have wineries throughout the city, not just that one specific area. So anyway, that was a long-winded recommendation for that parking situation there.
Sir, yes, come on up.
A couple things. One, before the resolution, the input that we gave is, one is everybody strongly does not want to limit the restaurant to 1,000 feet. Just for the same thing that Mr. Mosby said, is no restaurants. You can't have a restaurant 1,000 feet. And you can have a deli maybe, and the thing is that the restaurant zoning will allow, as deli is and the fine French restaurant, they're a restaurant. So the entrepreneur that decides to go in there won't be limited. You can, if you allow restaurants to a larger size, someone can go in and put a small deli in, someone could put in an industrial eats, okay? The other thing that we put in there was a desire to have easier stuff for food trucks, easier rules and regulations for food trucks. So we put in something that covers the whole gamut. And the question about, well, does the wine people want food trucks or they want restaurants? Really, they want everything. And some people have different priorities. They'll say, like, we're never going to get a restaurant, so at least give me a food truck. Other people are saying, hey, I mean, we may not be Santa Barbara, but we're very much like Buellton. I mean, 10 years ago, what did Industrial Way look like in Buellton? It was a crappy street, pretty much. And then you put in wineries, breweries, restaurants. That place is not necessarily walkable, but people are going there all the time, filling up the town. I think the wine ghetto is walkable. People love walking around the wine ghetto. It's not beautiful, it's not Los Olivos, but you throw a couple restaurants in there, it's going to be a big hit. And also, like Morris said, we only get a couple of shots every now and again for a business to come to Lompoc. That's not true with the wine ghetto. We look around at all of our neighbors are flush with wine business. Sometimes 10 or 15% of their citizens are living there because of the wine business. okay? Not because they're in it, they're retired into living in the wine country. This is a vision for Lompoc in the future, which is we're gonna have stuff sooner or later. It may be facilitated by us here, or it may just happen naturally because of our weather and our low prices. People will come here and this will be a wine country. Right now, it's not a wine country. If people aren't running around here, you can't find wine people everywhere. In the valley, you find wine people everywhere. Los Alamos, everywhere. The whole place is full of wine people. That's our future. It's just a matter of us creating it faster than it will happen naturally. And those people are right there. They can come right here. When that happens, things like the Hilton shuttle, their customers can come to the ghetto and go back, okay? Younger people these days, they don't drive to the ghetto. They get Ubered in and Ubered out. The restaurant, when the majority of the people are going to go there, nobody will be wine tasting anymore. That will be empty, and people will move to the restaurant for dinner. There will be an overlap at lunch, but when people go to the dinner, there will not going to be that big of an overlap. And, you know, if you control it through parking, and you get one restaurant in there, and you can allow them with parking, you know, we're not thinking a bunch of restaurants are going to come overnight and start opening up in a ghetto. We're going to pray for one to take a chance on it. But then if it becomes a nightmare, then the next person, you know, if he can't find the parking spots, he can't find the parking spots, okay? That's the risk mitigation. I don't think there's ever going to be a need to mitigate the risk because we're not going to, it probably can take 2 restaurants, 3 restaurants over a 5, 8, 10-year period, but they're not going to open that many more. So I do want our input from the consensus of the wine people to be in here. That 1,000 feet is not going to do it. Also, you mentioned that we can change the zoning. That's my experience, 5 years, never discussed. Sorry, guys, no zoning for that. You're going to have to wait till we're going to rezone in 5 years. I don't personally believe anyone else in my experiences has seen someone say, you know what, we'd love to have you do that. We're going to change the zoning for you today. Okay, I don't think that's happened very often. So it's our chance right now to have the wine business be much more of an economic driver, and bigger restaurants are what we need.
Okay, thank you.
Gotcha.
Okay. Yes, Councilmember Mosby.
I think, Councilmember Vega, you had a motion you made out there?
Yes, sir, I sure did, and I can reiterate it if you guys are asking me to iterate.
I believe you wanted to have on-street parking being counted in the numbers for parking requirements.
As an element for parking requirement, yes, sir. Okay, and the other one would be for the ghetto, would be the joint parking agreement, I think that, and then after that, we'd ask for some input from you, Brian, to see how we would accomplish that. Of course, that's my motion.
The standard reciprocal parking agreement, I assume?
Yeah, we would check to see if there's a reciprocal parking out there. I think there is, but I also just wanted to bring to your attention, in the parking section right now, drafted in the zoning ordinance, it does allow a reduction up to 25% of the on-site parking may be approved with a minor use permit. So minor use permit would be at the staff level. And it also says a reduction of up to 50% of on-site parking may be approved through a conditional use permit. So maybe if you use both of those techniques, the minor use permit, the use permit, and count on-street, not off-street, on-street parking, maybe that would suffice.
Microphone.
Yeah, Mayor, yeah.
Is that just for the wine ghetto, or are you saying for all development?
This is not privy to only the wine ghetto, but the wine ghetto could take advantage of that.
So can you tell me what section that is? I think it's, is that in the back? Non-conforming use of parking?
Let me just clarify one more thing. Jennifer reminded me that that's if you provide parking off-site. So this section is with a clause or provision that they are providing it, but it's within a certain amount of space or number of feet, which is the 400 feet, which is something I think has been discussed in the past.
But that doesn't seem applicable to the wine ghetto.
Well, it depends. It could potentially.
So, if I could, Mr. Mayor. let me know.
Okay,
Oh,
go ahead.
Mr. Yates.
Councilmember Vega. and
I
then
just
we'll
want to clarify, Brian, what's the easiest path to getting this done? We have the minor use permits, we have the CUP, or, listen, we're looking to shortcut this, I guess, okay? So basically what we do is how do we get to the shortest, to our goal right now?
Yeah, we could work on that. There's also another section which I think probably wouldn't be popular, but it also talks about a parking study. Obviously, that takes time and money.
Yeah.
But we would need to come back to you and entertain, some different alternatives, but definitely it would help to include the parking on the street.
I think the parking study's not where we want to go.
Yeah, I
Okay?
figured it
I think
wasn't.
that we're going to convolute things, and I think we can go through the mud and come out dirty, but I don't think we have to go that far. That's my opinion. I think we
Brian?
should.
wait a minute.
I'm
Commissioner Sioni first.
Since I believe that Councilman Vega was ready to make a motion, are we not going to include or consider the 1,000 square feet limit that Mr. Arrowhead brought up? Because I think that's pretty important and kind of makes a difference
If I can
between...
make I'd like to
Sure.
maybe have that as a separate discussion.
Okay.
Do the parking first,
sure.
and we'll do the size as a separate discussion. I think that would make more sense. Okay. Yes, Commissioner Leach.
I just had a question about the production part of the wineries. So in the back of each winery, obviously, is where their production is. And is that also all parking lot, or is that area segregated out for just, manufacturing and truck vehicle use and storage?
It depends. I walked around there a few weeks ago, and I think Mr. Arrowhead can attest to this, is sometimes there's parking in the back and sometimes there isn't. I think in Mr. Arrowhead's case, all the parking's in the front. There's nothing in the back. He has a neighboring property, but then other areas, you have roll-up doors, and you even have, trash enclosures and things like that that really limit how much parking is behind the building. But in general,
Can we look at that and maybe find parking behind the building?
Yeah,
Because
we can
when
certainly-
the math was done on calculating the parking for the, what do you call it, showroom or whatever they call it, the testing room, that was just placed in the front. And I'm not sure if we could find additional parking in the back where the production is done.
it's a possibility. Our consultant also has proposed some reduced parking for restaurants, which could be pros and cons, because if we looked at like Blaze Pizza, for example, that's about to open in a few months, there would be a parking problem there, and it probably wouldn't be received well. But if you applied this new parking ratio that our consultant has proposed to, say, the wine ghetto for a restaurant, it could be a win-win to get a restaurant in. So it's almost like a case-by-case basis on how you want to require parking. Because sometimes if it's a tourist-oriented business, you may want to have flexible parking. But then if it's constrained with neighbors and parking impact could be difficult, then you may want a lot of parking like we've seen with the medical clinic. So it's really a case-by-case basis, honestly.
Okay, so
Go
we
back
have
to
a
our
motion?
original motion, yes, sir. I think I'll go back, I'll stick with the parking, guys, thanks for all your input. We went off and then we'll deal with the square footage, thank you for bringing that up, I think it's important. So I'll make the motion that we use off-street parking as an element for our parking requirements. And joint parking agreements is also an element, I'd like to have that looked at, and maybe with your guys' recommendations, once we get through this, what's the easiest way to accomplish this without doing traffic studies and parking studies and all kinds of studies and all kinds of minor use and major use permits, okay? I think that probably if we keep it clean, there may be some instances like you described that where there may be a residential element to it where a case-by-case basis may be warranted to take a look at that, but that's my motion.
Okay. And does he have a second and a third?
I'd give him a second.
Okay, we've got a second.
That was on-street parking.
On-street parking.
Just, yeah.
It's not off-street, it's on-street
Did I
parking.
call it on-street?
You used to call it off.
Hold on.
Yeah, we know what
I don't want it off. You guys know what I mean? Okay, got you.
On-street. That's why we're clarifying.
On-street parking, okay, got you. You're right.
Then we'll give you your third.
Okay. Okay, I'll tell you what, let's take a 5-minute break, and then return. And I guess we want to discuss the size of the, potential size of the restaurants. And Before we speak on the size, I just want to question, I know there's been an issue with the sewer line over there.
Ding.
Okay, yeah, so what information can you give us on the size of the sewer line and how these restaurants are going to affect that?
Nobody from Public Works came. That's been an ongoing issue. I believe that the first restaurant in is going to get hit with that requirement. Our building official was here. I think he might have left, but they're going to get hit with that requirement, and that's nothing from a zoning standpoint that we can really address. That's just kind of the nature of the beast, is the first one in is going to get hit.
Okay, Commissioner Gonzalez.
Yeah, I reiterated that I didn't believe that the restrictive component was the council or the planning commission, but the impacts that were going to result from fire requirements, building code requirements, and health requirements. And there is nothing we can do about it, and the ABC. So we can be as flexible as possible, but ultimately what they ask for may not be what they ultimately want because of those other extraneous requirements.
Commissioner Rodenheim.
Yeah, we had quite a discussion the other night at the Planning Commission, and what we came out of that meeting with was the thought that possibly we should be looking, if we're going to make the first little food enterprises that go in there qualify to be full-blown restaurants, nobody's ever going to do it. It would be good to have some limited food operations, and that's kind of what we left that meeting with. Originally, we were talking about doing a special use permit that would be in existence until we get the zoning ordinance approved. And as we talked about it some, it seemed as though it would be good for that to actually be incorporated into the zoning ordinance, so that there might be the possibility of a limited food use that might be, like an electric pizza oven or something where the food prepared was mostly prepared off-site, but then brought there. And we've had, great experience with Divine operating that way. If you go to Southside Coffee, the food that they can prepare there with their microwaves and stuff is actually really good. And so to allow that kind of a use with short of restaurant permitting would be really useful, I think. And it would also then pave the way for somebody to see just how well a restaurant might work in that location. It might make that a little bit easier to do.
Commissioner Fink.
Yes, another consideration, as Commissioner Gonzalez said, there are square footage thresholds to what safety improvements you have to make to a property when you convert it from industrial to public assembly, which is what a restaurant is. So, as he said, we can say anything we want to and allow anything we want to, but the first guy that tries to open a 3,000 square foot restaurant is going to get tagged with a substantial amount of cost to construct his operation and open it. So I think maybe the prudent decision for us is to allow as much flexibility as we can in the zoning ordinance and let the business interests work it out amongst themselves as to what they want to do. And that's anything from a prepackaged tuna fish sandwich up to a full-blown French 17-course dinner. Anything in between works. And then let them figure it out for themselves, because after that, it's a business decision.
Okay, let me get, which one do you have? Okay, Councilor Starbuck.
Yeah, I was just going to do a lead in there. We've had numerous discussions. Sabani's property, 8-inch line, city arterial line, 6-inch. Not only Public Works, talk to wastewater. It's an interesting discussion. So it's going to have to be something that's going to be infrastructure driven. That's what killed the hotel. That's what's been the biggest hurdle. I mean, we're basically redefining industrial and turning it into a restaurant at this point. So I wanted to get on the subject that we were on about mobile vendors here. It's not listed in this draft about having it in industrial, nor are mobile carts.
Do you want to take that one separately from the restaurants?
Well, it's all the same food, but let's do it separate.
And didn't we do that the last meeting we had when we talked about food over in the ghetto? I thought we had a universal thing that we were coming up with.
We're going to go ahead and, even though we're still going to have that discussion, but there is a consensus, there has been in the past, that there's a desire to have that in the industrial areas. It was something that is not currently in here, but as long as we can continue to have a consensus, we can put it back to allow it in the industrial areas, that the mobile vendor, that is.
Right, well, I mean, the only place it would be listed, if I'm not mistaken, is 17.40448 and across there, correct? You know, all the way to 51?
So Brian, if there's consensus to put it back in from the council right now, then that's what you're looking for?
Right, and yeah, I see you said 17.40448, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, I've talked to Jennifer, and I think even part of her slide presentation showcased the fact that that needs to be put into the industrial, because right now it's clear that it's talking about commercial and mixed-use zones, so that's an easy fix.
Yeah, and one of the other things I'm questioning on here is why does this have to be approved by the director?
What were you thinking? Did you want that to just be, what level of authority did you want?
Where it's allowed?
Just allowed by right? It is allowed by right, but there needs to be some sort of application process, so it would be approved at a staff level.
They have registration, they would have insurance, they have a health permit. What else do they need?
Right, we can talk about that and see, usually there's some sort of review authority, so if you'd like it to be.
Botulism?
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so right now we're talking about non-restaurants. So Councilmember Starbuck, if you want to address that with a motion, and then we'll go back to the restaurants.
All right, I'd just like to go ahead and move that we include the mobile vendors and vending carts mirror each other and allow them to go ahead and move them into the industrial also.
I'll give you a second on that one.
Okay. And do we have a third?
I'll give you a third.
Okay. Let's go back to restaurants now. Sir, you want to come up here, because we maybe have some questions for you. Yeah, sure. Are you aware of the issues that we have with the sewer line there?
I'm aware that there's not complete agreement on what the issue is.
Okay.
I'm aware that there's a lot of wine stuff going on over there that's I don't know how they figure this out. I don't know what one restaurant on top of getting a new winery in here. I mean, I don't know how they do the throughput analysis to figure out that a restaurant's going to cause a problem with the existing pipes. Do they plug up now during harvest time? I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm aware that there's a problem, but I personally, because I want a restaurant there, maybe I'm a little biased that it's overblown.
Okay. Okay, can someone address, I think it's not just a one restaurant. I think one restaurant may work fine. I think if we open it up and there's 3, 4, 5 restaurants, that's, I think, when we're going to end up with a problem. I think that's what I'm hearing. Commissioner Fink.
Yeah, if I'm remembering the discussion we had about this, that line is a shared line. And Brian, correct me if I'm wrong, I think that the hospital is a contributor to that line, and so is the wine ghetto and other areas. Yeah. So it was a 6-inch line. Wastewater told us that they typically have to go there and inspect that line 5 times a month, I believe, and it's always blocked with something. So their thought was if they added additional input to the line, that may, you don't know which straw is going to break the camel's back, but you keep throwing straws on and eventually it's going to fall over. Well, that's the situation here. I'm thinking that there's an engineering formula somewhere that's available to address which 1 gallon of input would do it, but that'd be a pretty minute amount to measure. Now, whose responsibility is it for the line? When that line was originally constructed, it was constructed with the thought that there would be industrial use in the area. Over time, things got added and nobody paid for upgrades. So who should pay for it?
Well, that's clear. The city should pay for it. I mean, that's
Well,
clear.
Who should pay for it is their decision, not ours.
No, but it's clear. If you go around and ask 49 cities how they would fix this problem, they're either going to have the city pay for it, or they're going to have some massive development like a hospital that didn't have to pay for it. I mean, that's just low-hanging fruit there if I was running the city. But anyways, I'm not running a city, and I'm not qualified to do that. So there's just a lot of stuff there, and there at the end of whatever the line, I don't know where it is. So it's something that a new deli or a restaurant's not going to put that in. So if we want to go and kid ourselves that we want to really be a wine destination and have the first restaurant guy put an 8-inch line, I mean, we're kidding ourselves. We should take the money from the city, invest where people are going to come to the city and spend money. And there's only a few places, and maybe the wine ghetto is not one of them. But then we should invest the money somewhere else then to get the growth that is there.
If I could just add real quickly, this was discussed last year at the wine workshop. So our utility director at the time said very candidly they would need to do a flow study. And the same question was asked last year, who would pay for the flow study? And it would be the developer. That isn't necessarily something that has been talked about a lot, but it was brought up last year that a flow study would be the solution to find out what the sizing and the upgrades of those lines would be. So obviously that utility director has retired and now we have an interim, but that was the answer to exactly the topic we're speaking about right now last year.
Well, he doesn't have the budget himself. He's just defending his little teeny cubicle budget that says, I don't have the budget to do the whole city. This is a city problem. And it's not logical to have, I mean, why don't we have every new client that goes in the ghetto, the new guys do this? It doesn't make any sense. You're gonna stop development. It's a line that needs to be addressed and figure it out. I mean, the thing is, the city's already approved a bunch of wineries that don't have a capacity limit. Wineries could make 1 million cases here, and no one that's in their agreement, it's in their approval. So that would pump the line up.
Okay, we're going to come back to the commission now. Thank you.
Thank you.
We can sit here and we'll discuss this for hours. This has been the discussion. It's gone in a circle and in a circle and in a circle, and I'll just say it. That is going to be, from a staff level, it's going to be an impact. They're called development impacts. Unfortunately, our job as a commission is to make the procedures as easy as possible to stimulate this growth, but there are some things that we just cannot get around. And so it is what it is. I think what we should do is focus on the planning commission portion, your approval, and then staff is going to have to deal with that on a case-by-case basis when it comes before them.
Okay. Commissioner Cioli?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's beside the scope of this discussion. And, you know, what we need to decide here is whether we want to allow the issue to be put into focus and whether we want to allow these new businesses to come and pose the question, and then we're going to have to answer the question. And if there's going to be an infrastructure problem, then we're going to discuss the infrastructure problem. But I think it's beside the zoning discussion.
Councilmember Mosby.
it's not just a square footage issue. I mean, the square footage has a component to it, but it's the water meter hookup that might potentially be there. You know, you could have a 2,000 square foot restaurant that has minimum amount of water impacts. If you have a 2,000 square foot restaurant that has a 2-inch water line that's going to it, you're going to increase your sewer impacts accordingly. So it's more the meter that's being hooked up to it than the square footage of restaurant. And whether they need to have a grease trap or what size of grease trap that they're going to have because of their grease requirements and such. So, I mean, the square footage is just one component. There's so many other variables that come to it. What are you putting under your hood? You know, are you having open flame? Are you having fat burners, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that goes down the line? So, I mean, if they feel that the square footage is something that would trigger and make the movement, maybe the commission has a recommendation that we could look at as square footage. I think 1,000 isn't enough. And the other component, again, is going to be something that staff is going to determine whether, you know, they might need to be running a whole nother water line in there. Because along with that, you're going to have sprinklers. So maybe the 2-inch water line is not even sufficient there. And getting back to the issue of the wineries there, a lot of them, I think, only have 3/4-inch meters, water meters to them. That's why the sewer line was able to be a 6-inch sewer line, because you had all those little water lines that were there. So there's a lot of other variables that come to play in the calculation that there. But so maybe they could stay strictly on the square footage issue.
Okay, Councilmember Osborne.
So I think if there's a recommendation of a better way to assess potential square footage rather than a set limit, that we should examine that. Secondly, as far as staff helping to address the issue when proposals come forward, you might want to start looking at some of the more modern techniques that a lot of restaurants are using in areas like Napa, where there's restaurants focusing on being fully recyclable, where they're looking to put as little as possible into the sewage system or into the impact the community. So on site, when doing food production, there's full composting. When clearing the tables, instead of food being dumped into a sewage system, there's collection devices. So there are a lot of modern things that could be implemented that conscientious restaurants are doing as a way to have lower impact on the local landfills, on the local sewage and water impacts. So I think there are ways to address and help businesses if we're prepared to address the impact if we aren't able to invest in changing the infrastructure yet, but long-term make a plan to fix that infrastructure, because I do think there is some shared responsibility between development impacts and the city not initially having the foresight to demand a larger diameter when expanding over in this area. So again, I think that taking a better recommendation on knowing that it's the restaurant who chooses the size and the restaurant who is fully aware of the impacts by us educating them by choosing to go into this location, these are the impacts, and then also being educated as a staff to talk about creative concepts that are out there in the modern restaurant world that looks to have little impact on their community in different ways. So that's what I suggest as a way to move forward on this and you know, think outside the box.
If I just may add, I think that the square footage of a restaurant, I agree, it's not, with Councilman Mosby, is not really the deciding factor, and also I think it's naturally limited already by A, the market, and B, the existing infrastructure. So I don't think there's any reason to have a limit in the ordinance. You know, limiting the size by law is just gonna, you know, look funny to someone that wants to come in and put a restaurant in. It's gonna look arbitrary, and that's not really what we want, I think, in the ordinance. Again, there are already two very natural limits to that, which is, you know, one, the market, whether, you know, a bigger restaurant will make sense or not financially, economically, and two, the existing infrastructure that's going to become, you know, an issue. So I think that it should just be taken out, the limitation.
Councilmember Vega.
These are great points. I think what we're doing here is exactly as the planning commissioners have stated. Let's stick to the issues. But I do think in the future, when we have someone who comes in with very little monetary contribution to any of our public facilities, we should so note that if we have any covenants or clauses that say if we ever have to come back and we made a bad decision and you come back and you have to amend any covenants or clauses, so to speak, might be something just to keep in mind in the future for our infrastructure, because what we're stuck with now is we're going to have a restaurant ordinance and a restaurant may not be able to afford to come in. So basically what we would do is we'd put in a covenant or a clause that said, hey, if we have to create, in the event of making a bad decision later on, we have the ability to actually ask for an assessment district to be formed and property owners to have some skin in the game to upgrade our public facilities in order for their property to prevail. I think Mr. Sabani previously had mentioned that someone had some foresight before the hospital got in for free or before the wine ghetto was created, he would have been in favor of a district as a property owner. He would contribute. You'd have to get the other property owners to contribute that actually are using this system, which would have been the hospital, and it could have been Stodovich Winery, you know what I mean? But it's another concept, another way of, no one wants to pay, but if someone got in for free, it might be a way of coming back and readjusting what we're doing. That's my comment.
Okay, do we have any recommendations out of all this? Anyone? Oh, Councilor.
I think that sounds like a lawyer question to me, if we can go backwards. I mean, I think we can do things when we're going into something, but changing them after the fact, can you comment?
It's something that we can look into, but my concern with that is that the project that's coming in that causes the impact is the restaurant that wants to come in, and it's not the businesses that are already there. And it might not be fair to them or even legal to go back and make them pay for updating infrastructure for a new project, for a new restaurant that's coming in. But it's something that we can look at, and there are potentially things that could be done.
Yes, Councilor Starbuck.
Yeah, well, to get back on track with what we're doing here, looking under industrial zones, I see outdoor dining and then just this little section with restaurant, but in the very back, and this would be on 17.216-5, we're only allowed to have 15%. So is the restaurant going to be written in as an exception in this code, or how do you want to play that? Because it's not anywhere in here other than your table.
The way it's drafted, restaurants are allowed as a primary use. So even if it operates as an accessory use, in theory, it could be considered as two shared uses operating in the facility. So they could be, the way it's drafted now, not limited to the 15%. They could be up to the 1,000 square feet. Does that?
But it's not clear in here because it shows it as a permitted, other than the little nomenclature of one, each restaurant use and associated dining shall not exceed more than 1,000 square gross feet. So is that the way that it's written into the ordinance here?
That's the intent, and it could be, we can clarify that.
Well, I just wanted to be clear on myself because we've been around the wine ghetto several times here.
Understood.
One thing I'd just like to clarify that I think staff needs direction. It is an industrial area and a little bit of a business park as well. So if you just said restaurants are allowed and there's no cap on the square footage, you could maybe not realizing, but end up the whole area would be more of a restaurant area, which is more like a PCD or a C2 or Old Town, when it is industrial and we're not rezoning this area. Part of this project we're not rezoning, and so I think going back to what the consultant has advised us is it is industrial, so it's not really necessarily a cap only because of parking and only because of infrastructure, but it is industrial, it is business park. And so my fear is that if there's no cap, that you're essentially rezoning the area. It's kind of like the Old Town area. If someone said, I want to come to the planning counter and said, I want to put 100 apartments in, with no commercial, no other uses, you're essentially rezoning that area. And so that's another item that I think is important to mention. If you don't put a restriction, do you want it to change to now not an industrial area? That'll take a long time, but it
Well,
could
no, my point was, Brian, that we're, one side of we're over here, we're saying 15%, you know, you manufacture in the other 85, you taste in the 15. Now the restaurant component's out there, so it's not gonna fall under the B right here at limited accessory uses. It's gonna be its own separate use in an industrial area. And it's just this one little asterisk, number 1 here on the table on, 16-3.
Yeah, I see that.
So I just wonder if a verbiage clarification would help on this, or if you want to just go ahead and leave the table as it is. That was just my input on it.
I don't know if legal wants to maybe chime in on that, because I'm a little confused on how that would not change the zoning.
I actually don't see any problem with allowing uses that are not industrial uses in an industrial zone, because this is a special industrial zone. There's nothing legally wrong with allowing restaurants in an industrial zone. If the city council in its discretion finds that this industrial zone is appropriate to have restaurants, it's still fine to call it industrial and allow restaurants and not have any cap on the square feet. So we would just essentially, I think, delete that footnote 1. That's what the motion is.
Okay, we're going to go to Commissioner Gonzalez and Councilmember Vega.
Yeah, one of my thoughts was that rather than have an individual business limitation, and if you were trying to preserve somewhat of the industrial nature, is to limit aggregate numbers. So you wouldn't say that there was one business with 1,000 feet, but maybe say that a combination of full restaurant can't exceed 25% of the industrial area. And that would be a first come and first served basis, and you can do that with each classification. The vendor, not more than 2 vendors in any given percentage of square feet, not more than, 1 vendor of the prepared food, and, full sit-down restaurants, not more than, and you can do that in aggregate, and it's a first come, first serve. And those individuals that are willing to pay the impacts and come in are going to have somewhat of a monopoly once that limit is reached, and that's going to make them more sustainable to help offset those impacts.
Okay, we're going to go Councilmember Vega, then Councilmember Mosby, then Councilmember Sioni, and then Commissioner Leach.
Yeah, I would tend to say that the restrictions on square footage and the size of the business, or even having limitations, I think we should stay away from. I think the cost and the impacts of any infrastructure that's put in, if you were to tell me that I was going to go in there and put a 1,000 square foot business and expected to pay for sewer line and impacts, I would never make a return. I wouldn't invest. So I think, but if somebody was to come in and, depending on the size of these buildings out there, I'm kind of looking at is someone actually going to build a restaurant out there, or are they going to be using the metal buildings out there within the infrastructure? Okay, I'm thinking whatever the average square footage is of those businesses, I just don't think restricting the square footage is appropriate. And then again, with the free market mindset, it may take a couple of them to actually be able to afford these impacts, which actually is a benefit to the community, because any other business is going to come in and they're not guaranteed success either. So I think it's basically step up to the plate and do your thing. I think the impacts for sewer line are going to be pretty expensive, I think. So I think that it's going to be a restrictive connotation in its own. So I think I would like to stay away from that part of it. So whenever we're ready to make a motion,
We're going to get some more comments. Okay. Councilmember Mosby, then Sioni, and then Leach.
Wherever we end up here about restaurants, I think it's important that we make sure that it's understood in there that should this great restaurant go in and existing and doing well, and let's say a machine shop decides to go into the industrial park next to the restaurant, the restaurant needs to understand and always be understood that it's an industrial park. And so we don't end up with conflicts like a gymnasium that we had not too long ago with noise all the time and pounding. And could you imagine having this French restaurant with 17-course meals and right next to it's a machine shop doing what's supposed to be done in an industrial park. And I just think it's important to understand and make sure that it's written as such that otherwise you could chase everything out. And that's because wine business fluctuate. You go back to the 20s and 30s, things change, things move. And maybe the winery all decides the wine ghetto wants to go to Old Town and wants to relocate over there or whatever flow it might be. And then you have metal buildings going back in industrial and you have restaurants there. So I think it just needs to be important that it's understood that it is an industrial area, and whatever we do, I think that's why you guys were looking at the 1,000 square foot, because it wasn't necessarily the impacts of, well, you want to limit the restaurant impacts on industrial, is what your thought process was, where you're keeping it smaller, not a larger. That's where you're keeping a smaller percentage. Otherwise, you could end up with a whole industrial park being vacant because there's a restaurant there.
Commissioner Sioni.
Yeah, again, I want to restate the point that market takes care of itself and takes care of these things. Assistant City Attorney Malawi clarified that there's no legal caveats to allowing restaurants of any size into an industrial zone. If that's, again, we're within the realm of a special zone. And so if the market decides that this area organically will end up becoming a restaurant area, I think that's what's just going to happen. And in maybe 15, 20 years, we realize this is not an industrial zone anymore. It's more of a commercial zone. But that's, again, that's not today. That's not what we're doing today. So, again, I think I'm in favor with or my opinion is, of course, this is your decision, that we remove the cap, and also I don't think we should have a overall cap for the industrial area. Again, right now this is an industrial area, but if restaurants want to move in there instead of machine shops, then it probably evolve into something else. And I think that if there is a 17-course restaurant in there, the machine shop will probably not want to be right next to it anyway. They're probably going to go in an opposite location of the same industrial park. So, again, I think we are assuming that people don't make decisions based on their best interest and just randomly make decisions on where to go. That's not what happens.
Thank you. Commissioner Leach.
Oh, sorry, just for clarification, restaurants are allowed in all the industrial areas in the city, is that correct? It's not really just this ghetto area?
That's correct. It's not restricted to the ghetto. It's the I and the BP, and not just the ghetto.
Thank you.
Okay, comments? Any other? Councilmember Vega.
Thank you for your comments. I think that it's going to put Lompoc on the map on a business-friendly side. I think the disclosure is going to be also, it's going to be on the landlord also when he rents to his tenants. You know, it's going to come back to him. You know, if they don't disclose, hey, this is an industrial area. I think it didn't matter in the other, when the Ohana's gym came up, you know, that was a residential area, a little bit different. Industrial looks industrial, you know. I think as long as they don't build houses right up to it, I think it's going to be the landlord. I don't think anybody's going to come in here and purchase these little individual spaces the way Sabani has. If we're just looking at Sabani right now, it's tenant-based, you know, so I think it's going to be the landlord that's going to do it. And I think the other restrictions that we're going to have, they're already built in, you know, the impact on the infrastructure and the flow study and the sewer line. You're just not going to get a bunch of people rushing in here. I think they're going to end up going to food trucks and everything. And I think what Mr. Earwood said, hey, just let us have everything, and after that, let the market take care of itself. Whoever can afford to come in and pay for this infrastructure and move forward, it's a free market, it's free enterprise. Let's let it happen. And then these guys can have all those restrictions taken away, and they don't have to worry about, do we have to dance this way or dance that way? So whenever we're ready for a motion, sir, you know, go ahead. I'd like to make the motion that we move forward with allowing restaurants in industrial areas without caps or restrictions. Let the free market prevail. I think I understand also as a comment here, what Councilman Mosby said as far as they were expecting the square footage to be minimal so as not to impact the other businesses. I get it, but I just think the costs that are going to be associated with that are going to take care of that part of it. So that's my motion.
Do we have a second and a third?
I just want to clarify that the motion was stated pretty broadly as to allow restaurants without any caps or restrictions, but I just want to make sure we're only talking about the 1,000 square feet limitation that you want to eliminate, right?
Yes, sir.
And then the cap on the percentage of the industrial zone that can be restaurants? I think you wanted to take that away as well.
I'll take that away. Unless, Brian, you have any other input on that and how we can clarify that a little bit better? Because we're all working together on this.
I think that's fine, and we've taken that direction. I just want to remind the Planning Commission and council members that as a restaurant comes in, there'll still be a cap, because the planners will look at the site plan layout, and let's say there's 10 spaces in front, maybe like a Montemar, and so there will be a restriction as far as, the seating area. So it'll just be inherent as part of the parking regulations. But then at the same time, we'll look at flexible arrangements, nearby parking, parking agreements, et cetera.
So we have some flexibility to work with them, so there's no missed opportunities. That's what you're saying, right? Gotcha, man. Okay, that's my motion.
Okay.
I would give you a second, but I'd like to also tag on to that with the report by wastewater and city engineering, obviously, with this. Meter sizes, there's a lot of components out there that don't affect zoning, but will affect you in a DRB, so.
Right.
I second it.
Do you want that in the zoning code, or do you want us to come back with that?
No, because this is a unique incidence in the wine ghetto, but I mean.
He was just making a comment.
I want to comment on that, we'll buy the wagon, but the horse can't pull it here.
Okay, so we have a motion and a second. Do we have a third?
I'll give you a third.
Okay. Good deal. What else do we want to discuss tonight? Commissioner Fink.
I had about 35 things on my list, but
Sorry, but you told me I had to end the meeting at 7:30, so.
I'll eliminate 34 of them and go to the one I think that might be worth discussing. In section 17404190C3, we talk about music festivals. And I was wondering if the council wanted to establish some sort of a decibel limit for outdoor music festivals in venues, especially those adjacent to residential areas.
Okay, discussion? Councilmember Starlock.
Could we just fall in line with our current noise ordinance that's in place?
Yes, we could. This one's challenging. I did talk to Chair Fink the other day about it. The zoning ordinance would be in place. Now, with the festival, it would be based on a complaint basis. So if we did receive a complaint, we would go out there, we'd do an investigation. So on these seasonal type events, temporary events, we could discuss that, but it is something difficult to regulate because it's seasonal. And so, again, it would be complaint-based because everyone might be expecting the festival, but yet if it's in a nearby neighborhood, I think one thing we talked about just recently is entertaining things like talking to your neighbors before you have the event and notifying them. We have ability to restrict their hours through a temporary use permit or whatever permits attached with that festival or event. And so that's how planning has addressed that. But yeah, certainly the zoning or the noise ordinance would be in place and would still apply.
Just a suggestion on this that would make it simple. The industrial standards on noise are measured by decibel, and they're done with single hearing protection. If I'm not mistaken, it used to be 86 decibels was what would require hearing protection. 103 was double hearing protection. So if you just fell in with the industrial limits on it, then you would be covered. If you don't need hearing protection, then have a festival.
Right. Yeah. Now, one of my life experiences was 10 years as a reserve deputy sheriff. I will tell you that police officers do not like subjective requirements. They want something tangible in order to base their judgment as to whether there is or is not a basis for a complaint. If somebody just calls up and says, man, it's too noisy over there, well, the decibel level could be 75, and it would be too noisy for that individual. But that's not something that a police officer could make a objective judgment as to whether there is or is not noise. I think that your standard, the industrial standard, is a reasonable standard because that's something you have to protect your employees for, so why shouldn't you be able to protect the neighbors from it? So I would say use the industrial standard, establish it as the limit, that it cannot exceed the industrial standard of, I think it's 83 or 85 decibels beyond the property line of where the festival's being held.
Just to clarify, we have the table up on our screen, and what's in the proposed zoning code is consistent with the general plan, and it actually says manufacturing, utilities, warehousing, agriculture is interior 65 and exterior is 75, so I'm not quite sure where the 86 or where that number came
That's
from.
an industrial standard, and so there's already an established standard for residential, protecting residents from noises of houses that are being built. But this is talking about noise generated from an exterior festival that's going on that could drift across, easily go across the property line and, you know, affect people that don't have houses built to the current standards.
I'd like Jeff to maybe chime in on that. If we were through the temporary use permit that comes into our office, allow anything to deviate from the general plan and our zoning ordinance, do we have that ability to allow it through the TUP to have different zoning?
I wouldn't
noise
feel
standards?
comfortable allowing something with a TUP to exceed the noise rules in the noise ordinance or anything in the general plan. I actually agree with Chairman Fink that not only do law enforcement officers not like defined standards, but also attorneys don't. Attorneys like to have defined standards as well and not vagueness in the rules. So that it might be something that the thing to do might be to just look at the noise ordinance and decide to put decibel levels in the noise ordinance that governs the entire city and not specific use, not like call them out for each little specific use.
Yep.
But the noise ordinance is not part of the zoning ordinance, isn't that right? It's
Well,
something different.
we do have a table, and so it's consistent with the general plan. But we have it basically in 3 locations. We have it in a different chapter. We have it in the zoning ordinance, and we have it in the general plan. So we have it in 3 different sections. So we would have to amend all of those if we wanted to change it. And that could delay this project a little bit. Or we could adopt standards that address seasonal events and festivals and put it into the table and address it that way, but it might take a little more time to do all of those.
Why don't staff and I discuss this and we can bring it back at the next public hearing?
Okay, Councilmember Vega and then Councilmember Mosby.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with the city attorney and the other comments that were saying that we need to have one standard. I know that we're trying to address, I believe he's trying to address Ryan Park or something with a residential area around it, but they've been doing it so many years, I'm not sure, you know, exactly what the decibel level would be that the allowable for you could use an industrial standard, but it doesn't make sense in a park, you know, for something that's been long-lived. I just think that you should just have one decibel ordinance. The police can follow this. When we have a noise complaint, we have a noise complaint. I just don't think that we should go back and forth and be cutting it up. I think that makes more work for you, and it's going to delay this process. But so noted. Hey, I get it. There's people that are probably annoyed with the noise levels, but then there's a lot of people that don't like anything. So what do? So stick with one standard.
So obviously, most of the time in cities and county, they have standards that are different for residential versus, say, a manufacturing area, an industrial area. So you're saying just one standard regardless if it's residential or industrial?
Well, whatever our standard is right now, we've had festivals and we've had events for many, many years. If that's the same standard that we're going by, why make up a different standard for industrial?
Yeah, because right now it's different. The residential area
Sounds like it would
more
be,
sensitive area.
you could have a little more noise, it sounds like, under your proposal, so I got you, you know?
No, I was,
If you use the industrial standard,
yeah, I was.
it'd go up to 86 decibels, is that
I
correct?
worked occupational safety for a number of years, and then Councilmember Starbuck is correct. In an industrial application, you have to protect your employees. However, we do have a standard for residences which stipulates how the residence to be constructed, that it can't allow that noise to go in there, but the older structures, of course, weren't built to that standard.
Gotcha,
So,
gotcha.
all right, so I would be in favor of one size fits all for the entire city, and incorporate those limits that are in the limits he suggested would be in that ordinance.
Sure, I'm okay. I just didn't want to go with all kinds of different little standards. Okay, sir? Thank you.
Councilmember Mosby.
Other communities I've dealt with the standard and having a decibel meter is so important. It's important for both sides to know where they stand. And there's also time limits and time shift at certain times where you reduce it down significantly. So you're allowed to be a little bit noisier until a certain hour. So maybe you could look and see if that is something that we have available as well. I think right now with Ryan Park, we basically go to 0 at 10 o'clock, I think. Isn't that what we do? Something like that? But we allow, but having that ability instead of guessing, because it makes it very difficult. We had an incident not too long ago again at Solvang Brew with a band in there and some noise. And they weren't quite sure what's what. I let them borrow my decibel meter so they can see how loud things are. They can go around and monitor their property. Because what might be loud for you might not be loud for them. So it's important to have that black and white. Of course, you know, but I think there is also a time limit that comes through as well. You know, on a windy day, for example, those people aren't really familiar, wind in the pine trees is about 85 decibels when you hear it whistling through the pine needles. So, I mean, you know, think about that, and would you be offended if somebody was having an event with 85 decibels at 7 o'clock in the afternoon, so, or evening?
Okay.
I have one final comment if I could, okay? Let's just, my recommendation would be keep it simple. You know, we're over here trying to gauge by wind and snow and smog, and I just think we've dealt with this all kinds of years. We're trying to be business friendly. Let it go. You know what I mean? I get it. Let's have one standard so the police can have one standard, the residents can have one standard. When you give the permit out for the special event, I'm sure there's restrictions and there's some sort of guidelines there already. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. I'm sure they know what time they have to turn it off and what time they can turn it on.
Councilmember Mosby, did you like?
Yeah, if I could. The problem with our noise ordinance right now is it says, I believe, anybody perceives something defined. So there's a level of perception. It's not by a gauge. Right now, it is by perception. So it doesn't have the identifiable sound meter. It's about what is perceived by, what's it say, somebody in the right state of mind or something like that. It has, what's that? A reasonable person. So, well, I'm just saying it's pretty loose.
I'm pretty reasonable.
Just as the city attorney said, they
We're
like
beating
to
this
have,
horse to death.
you know, I just think it'd be easier if it's black and white.
Commissioner Gonzalez.
Are we off this subject? Because I have.
No, we're still on.
Okay, then. I'll defer until we're finished with this topic.
Well, I think that we have all the comments from the commission and the council, and I can just get together with Brian before the next meeting, and we can try to take your comments into account and do what you guys would like to do, make it more black and white and more well-defined in our noise ordinance.
Is that the desire of the council? Yes. Okay, good. Commissioner Gonzalez.
So it's okay to go to another subject matter that's of general concern. So accessory dwelling units, as you're aware, the state has recently enacted some laws that somewhat strip municipalities of planning and development standards. However, I just wanted to share some statistics and suggest that we follow along with the state's guideline. The state does not put a restriction on owner occupancy. Housing and Community Development, who monitors housing for California, their most recent study showed that California in general should be building approximately 180,000 housing units per year to keep up with demand. They're presently at 80. We are failing to provide adequate housing. Most recently, HUD came out with what they consider fair market rents. So hang on to your seats. A studio is now considered fair market rent if it rents for $1,104 in Lompoc. A one-bedroom, $1,297. A three-bedroom, $1,520. Excuse me, a two-bedroom, $1,520. A three-bedroom, $2,064. And a four-bedroom, $2,403. I think if we have an opportunity, I think the state has some foresight in bringing additional housing to the community across the area, but I think Lompoc could utilize this. We are not providing enough housing, and what I don't want to see is additional affordable rental projects come to town that strip us of our tax base. I think this is a way to provide housing. It will increase the value of our parcels, and because of the additional, when someone goes and pulls a building permit, the building officials then pass it to the county. Those properties will be reassessed for the additional value of those accessory dwelling units. I just don't see the need to restrict it to simply owner occupied. And I have to, there's going to be some people that are going to argue the density, but you know, we keep saying don't expand, don't expand, don't expand. And then when an opportunity comes for infill, don't expand, don't expand, don't expand. We have to do something. So that's just my 2 cents.
Commissioner Fink.
Well, I got a couple points to make. First, when I first saw this accessory dwelling unit thing come from the state before it even appeared in the zoning ordinance, I thought, well, they're converting R1 properties to R2 properties, because that's what you're doing. If you have two separate residences on a lot, that's an R2 property. The second thing is the reason, in my mind, and Commissioner Gonzalez may be able to help on this, the reason that they're not constructing houses is that the state keeps adding costs to construction that has to be recovered somewhere, and it's the buyer of the property that's going to have to pay for it. The best example is their recent legislation on requiring solar panels on all houses. That was just the tip of the iceberg. They also required changes to the heating systems, to the plumbing systems, to the windows, and to the doors, and to the insulation value. So it probably increased the price per unit of a house $50,000, $60,000 on initial construction cost. So, all right, we don't have enough housing. Why not? Well, it's external forces. In this instance, we have some ability to say, all right, if the kids are going to stay at home until they're 45, I guess we had better add a separate apartment for them to stay in, right? So, and we don't really want them coming into my kitchen and screwing things up, so we're going to make a separate dwelling unit for them. Well, you know, I'm okay with that. That's a family member. But if we're going to say it's okay to rent to 6 young people who want to rent a one-room apartment and put bunk beds in there and park their cars all over the neighborhood, I think that's a little much to expect. So there has to be some limitation to what we do with accessory dwelling units.
Commissioner Leach.
Concerns, not about that. I mean, it's very bothersome to me that if you want to live in an R1 zone, you may not be able to in the future because we have no power to control whether or not somebody puts a second unit in their auxiliary building in their garage or whatever. And of course, it's going to be garages because there's, particularly in Lompoc, there's not that many auxiliary buildings in an R1 zone. And so the cars that were parked in the garage obviously are now going to be parked on the street. And I think it's going to be a little bit difficult to prove whether the owner is living in the house or not. But, you know, particularly if the owner sells it after he's built this auxiliary building. But I do think to maintain the R1 integrity, it would be nice to leave an owner-occupied a parcel there. I just think it would kind of help protect the quality and the tone of the R1 zone. However, there's one thing that's not in here that does bother me, and that is that there needs to be access from the street to the alley for both parcels, for both units. And this issue actually came up way back in the 80s when there was a move to kind of cut down some of these older city plats on the south side into 2,000 and 3,000 square foot parcels where you would have them, you know, kind of commingled. Some of them were condos, some of them were houses, all on the same lot. And the problem was access. One of the problems was access to the alley, because the front unit needs to take their trash out there. They need to have access to their utilities if the city's coming to meet them for problems. And the back units need access to the street. Parking's on the street. There's no parking in the alley. Assuming even if they have a garage attached to their unit, they're probably going to have additional cars, and those are going to need to be parked on the street. And we do not want to make alleys into streets. And alleys are, whether we like it or not, a lot of alleys are not as safe as streets. So do you really want people having to walk home through alleys to get to their units? So I think there needs to be, part of the ordinance has to have a requirement that there be access from the street to the alley for all the units. And that way the trash guy doesn't have to come around, pick up in the front as well as in the alley, and there would be accessibility for all the units.
Mr. Mayor?
Yes.
I just want to make a couple comments coming off of Commissioner Leach's comments. The first was, you mentioned about converting garages into residential ADUs. One of the things that the state law allows us to do is to require replacement parking on site if a garage is converted into an ADU. And our current code does that. I believe our new code is going to do that. So if anyone converts their garage to an ADU, they do need to replace the parking on site, and if they don't, then we can deny the ADU for garage conversions only. The other thing is, I just wanted to make sure that everyone is aware what the definition of owner-occupied that we're talking about here is, because it does not, and planning can correct me if I'm wrong, but as I understand it, owner-occupied doesn't mean that the same family has to live in the home and the ADU. If the unit is owner-occupied, it just means that the owner of the parcel must live in either the home or in the ADU. They can still rent out their ADU to a non-family member. Okay.
To me, that if there were going to be issues about the resident, a rental unit on an owner-occupied parcel is going to be a lot more cared for than a rental unit on a rental unit parcel.
Could I clarify something that's a real important point, expanding on Malavi's comment? So if the garage is converted, replacement parking shall be required, but the key is, it talks about, but may be located in any configuration on the same lot as the ADU. So that means that the driveway could be that replacement parking. So they don't need to build another garage. They don't need to build another carport. That driveway, that paved surface could be the replacement parking, because that is any configuration. And so the state is, fortunately or unfortunately, depends on what side you take, is wanting to encourage and is wanting to move in that direction where they don't want to put barriers to the ADU. So correct me if I'm wrong, the driveway can suffice. So you're not going to see a replacement garage or carport, because most people are just going to say, we're not going to do it.
You're correct, and the state law also forces us to allow tandem parking as replacement parking if tandem is possible on the site.
So is this replacement parking for the original unit there, or is it providing parking also for the accessory unit?
It would basically, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jennifer, but it would basically be addressing both. Because the replacement parking is the driveway, And also the parking for the ADU is also the driveway, because it says any configuration, including tandem.
So let's assume only 2 cars could fit there.
Right.
So that's all you're going to provide is 2 parking spots for 2 houses.
The driveway,
Essentially, or
right,
2
and you're
units.
going to see cars, we'll just be very candid, you're going to see cars parking on the street as well,
And
which is
the-
topic we just talked about, on-street parking.
I got you.
Commissioner Fink.
Right, we have there's a requirement in here now that says that requires 60% landscaping on R1 lots. And R1 lots can be a minimum of 7,000 square feet, which means that well over half the lot is in landscaping. So my question is, does the driveway constitute the landscaping? Or how will this accessory dwelling unit fit into the 60% landscape requirement?
It will already be there. They're not building new units, they're converting an existing
Right.
structure. So you're not changing the landscaping or the driveway, really.
So like my neighbors are gonna park on
Hey,
the
Bob.
lawn, right?
I've been waiting a
Okay,
while.
let Commissioner Fink finish. We'll go to Commissioner Gonzalez and we'll come to Councilman Vega. You're done, okay. Commissioner Gonzalez.
Yeah, there's development restrictions from the state. You cannot add a unit that exceeds 50% of the existing unit square footage or 1,200 square feet if the unit is larger than 2,400 square feet. So you can build a building that's in essence half the size of the existing building to a maximum of 1,200 square feet.
Okay.
So I didn't understand that you could build it.
Okay, Councilman Vega.
You're exactly right on those restrictions and those setbacks. You know, the accessory dwelling designation was basically what we used to call granny quarters. In one respect or another, where you convert either a garage or you add on a little bit of space somehow for an older person. I think I tend to go along with the state guidelines because it's unenforceable. You know, you basically can have a granny unit and you can move out of the house and you can rent that out and no one can say anything because it would be a legal unit. As far as the parking restrictions, which have been relaxed because previously you had to replace any lost parking or garage, as the city attorney said, with some sort of a carport or something to suffice to make up for that extra parking. And without that requirement, it makes it even easier. I think that it actually is a value building tool for property owners. I wouldn't look at it as turning it into an R2 because I don't think that it's a new structure, so to speak. I think it's an add-on of the existing structure. Unless the city attorney, would you like to clarify on that, or what exactly an accessory dwelling is as far as?
It could be an existing garage or an existing accessory structure, or it could be building a new attached or detached structure.
Gotcha.
All those could be ADU.
Gotcha. So I tend to think that it's unenforceable. I think that we can say, hey, it's got to be owner occupied, but there's no restriction to say they can't move out and move that and sell both and rent both units out. So my comment is I think it's a value building tool for property owners. I don't think it's going to be where everybody's going to be rushing in to do this because we thought that was going to happen before. It just makes probably with a little bit more clarity, it helps the planning department and helps the people coming in that want to do that improvement to their home.
Commissioner Leach.
So how does this work if somebody...
Bring the microphone close.
If somebody can build another unit on there, I understood that it was existing accessory units and but if somebody can come and build another unit on there, how do you do the open space and all the other requirements that are in an R1 zone?
Yeah, they'd still, when the planner reviews those drawings, it would still have to meet all the development standards. So the thing that's going to get tricky is that the state wants ADUs so much that, you know, push comes to shove, and I would defer to Jeff, that there might be some areas where we would have to be flexible. For example, probably the best one is, let's say they can't meet setbacks. The state is telling us that if they can't meet setbacks, say zoning setbacks, At a minimum, they need to meet fire and building code. So let's say, for example, right now the setback's 5, but they can't meet the 5 for some reason. If the building code allows them to do 3 and they have a certain construction type, like a 1-hour firewall, they could actually do, and we couldn't say no to that ADU if it didn't meet setback. So even though, yes, we're gonna look at the development standards, push comes to shove, I don't think we have a lot of ability, right, Jeff, to say no.
Well, we've almost gotten to the limits of my knowledge about the state ADU law, but I do know that in the new state ADU law, there are certain categories of regulations that we can adopt on ADUs, and there are certain categories that we can't and that are preempted. I don't specifically know about the open space category, but it is in the statute, and we will make sure that the zoning code update complies with it.
And getting back to the other comment, it doesn't have to be attached. It doesn't have to be within the existing living area. It can be a new detached structure, no more than 1,200 square feet, or if it's attached, no more than 50% of the existing living area. Is that correct?
And I think the thing that staff is really looking for here, direction from council and the planning commission, is whether or not one of the units is owner occupied.
Correct, yep.
Commissioner
I just have a quick question. Would renting a room out constitute something like that? Let's say one has a 4-bedroom and rents 3 bedrooms to 3 different people?
No, that's not an
different thing?
ADU. The ADU is actually really strict, where they have to have a separate entrance, they have to have cooking facilities, and I would defer to the building department, but I think that there might even be the ability to require separate laundry facilities, but that I'm not sure. But so it would have to be segregated and separate entry, and I don't even think you can have through access like through the hallway. It has to be separate. So just renting out a room, no, that's not an ADU.
And so is renting out rooms allowed? I'm not sure if that is something that is allowed in Lompoc.
Renting rooms is allowed, but no more than 2. If you do more than 2, it becomes a rooming house, and that would not be allowed.
Further discussion? Okay, did we give staff direction?
The direction we're looking for is if the council would like it to have one of the units be owner occupied.
I'll make that motion.
Okay, go ahead.
I'd like to make the motion that the unit not be required to be owner occupied.
Okay. So no owner on the premises?
I just think it's unenforceable, okay? I think that anybody can do an accessory structure right now and a granny quarters. This isn't a new law or new rule. This is actually already allowable in the R1 zoning districts, correct, isn't it? I thought you were always able to do a granny quarters.
Nope, no, that's not correct. This is a new state ordinance that took effect at the end, I think it was December of 2016, so no, it wasn't allowed before. Now, if someone added on to their house and they wanted to have that area, separate, but I think what you might be referring to, Councilman Vega, is a long time ago it was allowed, but not now. If you took an R1 zone, you couldn't add another unit. But now you're allowed to. We're just simply want to get clarification on owner occupancy, because right now the way the code is written, and I actually directed it this way so we can be conservative, and then if we need to change it, we can change it, is if you want to take that clause out for owner occupied, then you would direct staff, if everyone agree, or if we have a consensus, and we'll take that out.
Gotcha. Did, Nick, did you have something to say?
I was just going to state that previously it was referred to as an echo unit.
Yeah, I got you.
And I don't recall if that had requirements of owner occupancy.
Okay.
But you're going to throw something inside the market that's just going to convolute everything. It's you take care of the problem now, or you take care of it later.
Yeah,
So.
thank you, Brian, for that clarification. Okay, I know previously you could do a couple different things. But I'd still like to make my motion saying it need not be owner occupied. I think it's basically unenforceable for anybody to do this for any length of time. You can do it right now for the improvement, but they can move out.
Let me just clarify, because there's kind of 2 sides, and I'm not taking any side. I want to hear what everyone says, but the way that it's drafted is they would have to do a covenant. And so that covenant would be recorded against the property. But you bring up a very good point. You know, how would you enforce it? Essentially, the neighbor would complain. I'd send a code enforcement officer out to do an investigation, and if the owner didn't live there, we had proof, then we basically, the challenge would be, okay, you have an ADU, you tell the owner to come back because they have this covenant, or how would you address it then? It would be difficult, but the covenant is how cities are addressing it, and that's the way the code is written now, as a
Okay.
covenant.
I got you, so I'd rather go with the way the code's written with the state at this time. Is that
Which
correct?
to
Is
give
that
the-
what you were saying? That
Which is
one-
to give the city flexibility to not have it owner occupied. Is that correct?
Well, we need to have a little clarification here. In the beginning, it was stated that the state had a different guideline. Is that correct?
No, the state is giving city and county governments the
authority to
flexibility,
change it.
flexibility to not have it owner occupied. That's drafted right now
I
to
got
be
you.
owner occupied, because we just took the conservative route.
I got you.
Knowing that
I
it was
got
going to
you.
be discussed. So the state does not require it to be owner occupied.
Okay, then I'll go with that recommendation.
Which is to not require owner occupancy.
Only because it's
That's,
unenforceable.
yeah, that's okay, so that's, okay, so we understand that. So now we need a second and a third.
I'll give a second.
Okay, and do I have a third?
I'll third.
Okay. So clear directions now? Okay. Other points we want to discuss? Councilmember Osborne.
So in trying to design a zoning ordinance that is as flexible as possible, what I don't notice is a modern phenomenon that would help us address some of our housing needs in a more modern concept, and I want to find a place for it, and that would be the concept of tiny homes. So I understand that some communities have addressed it under mobile homes, but when you look at our mobile home restrictions, it would take a large parcel and demand a lot, and some properties might not be 10 acres in order to put in a large facility, and somebody might have a small lot that would want to do maybe 5 tiny homes. So I'm looking for how do we incorporate it, given it's something that's currently going on and is a flexibility that I'm looking to address a current issue, but could address long-term issues and also fit under, technically it fits under an ADU, because somebody could drop a tiny home in their backyard right now, but an ADU is a limitation to being attached to a current dwelling, whereas tiny homes aren't. So if staff or the consultant could feasibly explain how we might be able to incorporate tiny homes, not in a large capacity like mobile home parks, but on smaller lots, I would appreciate that.
So one way we have addressed that in some degree in the code is that we no longer include minimum sizes for unit types now, which is in the code now. So now there's a minimum size for studio, 1 bedroom, et cetera. So that has been removed. So that's no longer a barrier in terms of tiny homes in the zoning code itself. Typically, the primary barrier to tiny homes is located in the building code. So it depends if you're interested in looking into like tiny home subdivisions. That would be looking at different minimum lot sizes and standards that aren't currently addressed in the zoning code, maybe addressed in the subdivision ordinance. But that would be outside of the scope of what we've looked at here today, but we have removed the barriers we see in the sense of minimum unit sizes. Okay.
A quick question, Jennifer. Do they have tiny little cars too, so we have lots of parking?
Does this satisfy your,
I just wanted it on record. So.
okay. Other issues for discussion? Oh, Councilmember Mosby.
Yeah, I had two. One was with the old H Street overlay, and with requiring or allowing and moving the commercial buildings up to the sidewalk, where we've been having them set back, further back for years and years and years, and 98% of H Street is built. And I think the classic example that you're going to have of an issue is if you go down in where you have Chipotle and Habit that are set back, and the new construction is set forward. And if you're going north on H, you can't see the existing building, the Chipotle and Habit, because they are now hidden. Likewise, when you come out and you come to that sidewalk, you have to creep, and you're on the sidewalk, you're on the pedestrian right-of-way when you're trying to get on H Street. So I think moving this now, if somebody had done this design years ago, I can see, but the fact that we have now, we've got the buildings are behind, and if you start putting buildings further up onto the sidewalk, you're going to be blocking the other buildings that are already constructed. And you're going to end up with this patchwork of some in front, some behind, and you're really going to create a mess. And I think I challenge anybody to go, because when you go and you're coming out of the Chipotle and Habit parking lot, you look right, and then you look left, because the traffic's coming from the left. So you creep a little bit more, and by the time you look back right again, you're in the middle of the sidewalk. So I think having these buildings on the H Street moving forward, and granted it would take time because people are going to be tearing things down or building out more on their parking lot, but I think you're really going to create issues of hiding neighbors' properties by doing this. When you have everybody else already required to be a certain setback and everybody else, new developments will be up on the sidewalk, you will be blinding people's signs and people's properties. We try to be observing that we didn't offend the neighbors and least amount of impacts on neighbors by doing that. But I think the classic example is if you look and see what I guess it's the Blaze Pizza building. So when you see that building and see how it hides the Chipotle and Habit significantly. And likewise, Panda Express is hidden when you're going southbound. So I think that quaintness that you're trying to come in by narrowing the street actually is a negative effect.
Commissioner Gonzalez.
Yeah, I'll chime in on that because I was just at Chipotle today. My daughter called me. I forgot my lunch, so I get in the car. I go get Chipotle. I'm getting out. I stop behind the line because you get tickets if you don't. And I look, there's no traffic that way. I go, and here comes a bike on the wrong side of the road, and there goes my head, right in front. No way to see him because right now there's the fence. But if there was even worse so if there was a building. And I know I went recently to look at the requirements for fencing in residential, and in residential they're requiring a 12-foot corner, and you can't put anything higher than 4 feet from 12 foot of any corner where there's a thoroughfare, where a driveway or an inlet or an outlet. And at first I'm like, yeah, but I want my 6-foot fence for privacy all the way. But I understand it after what just happened to me, today. So that is to me, it's more of a safety concern. You build buildings all the time and they block your, we can't control that. But from a safety standpoint, I think there needs to be at least some type of minimum setback where an average car that would come up would be able to see in both directions before pulling out, especially on H Street.
Commissioner Leach.
So I think that we probably made a mistake on that development because aren't there triangle sight lines that are required, and we didn't have that on that particular parcel, I don't think.
No, I think we did. Yeah, there's the site triangle, and yeah, it's very close, but I'm almost certain that it did meet the site triangle, but we can certainly talk about that later. I think with that site, it's actually a difficult example to analyze because you would think that all that land behind it is theirs, but it's not. There's another pad, which is going to be challenging, that may be built in the back, that vacant area. So if that pad in the back was owned by, Blaze Pizza, they could have moved the building back, but they had a really tight spot to work within. So, the building, most people do prefer to see a building as opposed to a sea of parking, but in that case, it is pretty close.
Commissioner Fink.
Okay, there's another example of a building that's flush with the sidewalk, and that's McDonald's. Now, that sidewalk there is considerably wider than the sidewalk at the building we're talking about. So perhaps we could put something in there if the sidewalk width is 10 feet or 12 feet, whatever it is there in front of McDonald's, then you could build flush to the sidewalk. Would that satisfy you, Councilmember Mosby?
They would give you some satisfaction for the pedestrian aspect, but again, a lot of people also, the secondary reason was people build on H Street because they want the vehicles to see them. So
I agree there.
If their building's back at 25 foot and the next guy's 12 foot back, you're still going to block the view of their signage. And so I think you're impacting, by modifying the standard now, you're impacting existing buildings and existing signage. So we're gonna allow the people to creep their signs out to the sidewalk, then we're gonna have a run of, So I just think when you start doing overlays like this, like we're doing in other places, after the fact, we're trying to create a new design after we've already built 98% of H Street.
Yeah, well, I agree there, and I was part of the decision-making process for that building you're talking about, and I'll be quite honest with you, I didn't envision that problem whenever we okayed that project. Had I envisioned it, then we might have done something different.
Well, there's not much we can do about it, that building right now. So, yeah.
I just think buildings are built, built close to the site. To the maximum extent feasible is what it says, 17.2.24-12. I just think, again, reiterating what I've said before, 98% of it's built back. Now you're putting things in front. I think you really need to look at the impacts that you're creating by doing this. I think that should be done away with and keep the standards that we're rolling with already.
And if I may, the requirement for bringing buildings up to the street doesn't require that they be brought up to a 0-foot setback, aligned immediately to the back of the sidewalk. It does provide a 0 to 5 foot, at least the way it's written now, spacing. So the developer would have flexibility in terms of locating the building 5 feet from the property line or closer. If there's a concern about closeness to the street, we could talk about that build-to line just being that 5-foot separation from the street itself. Then we can provide a consistent building frontage and building location on H Street for those infill projects, but still provide some separation.
And I get it. It's if you see it and you drive the street and look at that one specifically, when you see it, you're going to create other issues, because if we have more and more of these happen, when people are driving and they're not really familiar with the town, they're looking at that signage. And you don't need them locking up going, oh, here's my turn right here. And the longer the advanced knowledge they have of this is my entrance, the better. And I think that's why we had signs here and we had buildings behind them. And I think you'd be conflicting with what the design is of the town currently. That was my concern.
Okay, so what is the recommendation that we can correct this for future?
Well, I'd suggest instead of looking at a 0 to 5 foot build-to line, we can talk about that being 5 feet, maybe it's 5 to 10 feet, and incorporate the finding for, we always have a finding for safety. So clearly we can work on the language, but we understand your intent.
Okay.
The other one, I think there's going to be a significant impact. And that is you have a lot of reduction in parking. One is the assembly parking. I think if you put a facility in, what was it, one per, what did that come down to? On assembly?
On assembly, the proposed parking rate for assembly is 1 space per 300 square feet.
So, and right now, what are we doing now? I forget what, I didn't write it down in my book here.
Right now, it's 1 space per 5 permanent seats, or 1 space per 35 square feet. So to equate it, 1 space per 35 square feet versus 1 space per 300 square feet.
So there's a significant reduction. Again, one of the reasons why we're doing what we're doing is reduce impacts on neighbors. And if you allow an assembly to go 1 per 300, 1 per 200, that's a significant reduction of parking requirements for an assembly type use. I think you would just be, again, if they have the ability to get reciprocal parking agreements, that's great. But if they don't, you're going to be burdening communities just significantly by doing that. I mean, I've witnessed it. So that's one. The other where I don't think you'd be doing justice, that was a significant reduction, was for restaurants. And doing one space per 200 square foot, again, you're going to be jeopardizing the restaurant. You want the restaurants to have the ability to have people to get there without burdening neighbors. And a good way to make them fail, I mean, we've seen it with the recent brewery that opened up Thank goodness that he did put parking in, because people wouldn't have parked a block away and walked to that place. And having that parking plan and such, he could use more, without a doubt, which helps benefit their business. I mean, how many people have driven by? If it's full, you go somewhere else. Or you drive around the block once or something like that. But we're burdening neighbors. And I think the requirement that they had before for restaurants, and again, if it can be with reciprocal and you're allowing some on-street requirements to help our on-street calculations. But we had it 1 per 60 for the table spaces before, 1 per 60 square foot, and 1 per 250 square foot for, I guess, the back kitchen component, which, you know, you're going 1 for 200 square foot. I mean, that's a significant reduction. I think you would be hurting the viability of a restaurant by reducing it that significant.
Okay, so what are you requiring? What are you recommending?
I'm recommending on that one, and as well as the assembly, to keep them as written in the old plan.
Okay, then I don't think we need a second or a third on that then. We do. Okay, so I need a second and a third on Councilmember Mosby's request.
Just a question on this. Is this something that we could put as a question in the public hearings? I mean, we're in here making all these decisions, but, well, we got a consensus and all that. I mean, we should bring these up at public hearings.
This is a public hearing.
Well, I'm going to consider this a workshop. We've got 2 public hearings coming up. So, I mean, rather than make all the decisions, can we rehash them again sometime?
What I was thinking is part of the presentation for the public hearings, both for Planning Commission and City Council, is reiterating these topics. We're taking really good notes, and we'll reiterate these topics and the changes that were made so that the public, if they disagree or they feel like they want to talk about those subjects, we'll kind of draw it out, kind of like tonight's presentation, we're drawing out certain issues. So that could be part of the presentation and the staff report as well, if you'd like, to make it more transparent.
I guess what it is here is, I'd like to second this, but I don't want it to become the grail. You know, I'm for lessening parking requirements, but then on some hands, I think certain parts do require the parking. So if I go ahead and say second, I'd still like the opportunity to change my mind on it.
Well, and you could, but obviously, we'd want to look for, at that moment in time, when we come to a public hearing, a majority.
Right, so I'll second it.
Okay, and do we have a third? Okay, that fails. Yes, Commissioner.
Since we're on parking, I might be beating a dead horse, but...
Speak into the phone.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm truly concerned about all the reduction of parking in here. I know that there are certain situations where it's really healthy to have reduced parking and to have tight, you know, groups of people together, but there's other times when it really isn't good, and I do agree with Jim on this. But I'm concerned about the non-conforming use parking 17620-7. And basically what I understand is if a use changes and the new use coming in can't meet the parking requirements, well, there's reduced requirements then. And buildings last a lot longer than the uses in them, generally. And of course, when the old Grefco was converted to a winery, the amount of parking required there was reduced substantially because of the use. But if that use changed to almost any other possible retail, industrial, or manufacturing use, there would not be enough parking there because those parcels were split. That entire Grefco parcel was split with that, the remaining building having far reduced parking considering the square footage. You know, I think there are just, I wish you could hear how many parking issues we have. We hear parking issues a lot. And I'm concerned that a use would be allowed into an existing structure that would then tremendously impact all the neighbors because they would not meet the parking requirements. So I think I see a pattern here throughout the whole book, actually, where parking continues to be reduced when we continue to hear over and over again that the lack of parking is a problem.
So are you suggesting that if there is a new use coming into an existing building, that the parking will be reevaluated based on the new use?
Yes, it should be.
Okay, that's just to clarify. Okay.
And I think that happens today, doesn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, that's what we call an intensification. So let's
Sure.
say it was a general office and then became a medical office. The planners look at that as an intensification, and then we would expect them to meet the parking requirement.
But here in 17620-6, you're giving them an out. You're saying, oh, we'll take a look at it and give you an exception.
Yeah.
Because it was a previous use, and I have a concern about that.
Right, the section I think that we're referring to is on page 7. It says change in use. For any change of use or manner of operation that would
Exactly.
increase the number of parking spaces required, no additional parking shall be required unless the review authority determines that the change in use would require 30% or more parking spaces than currently exists.
So there's
that's-
it's almost like there's like a 30% tolerance in the changed use. If the changed use is no more than 30%, then there's no change in parking requirement. Right, this is the way it's written right now.
And 30%'s a high bar. You know, I could go for 10 or 15, but I think 30%'s a high bar.
Does anyone on the council want to pick up on this? Commissioner Fink?
Yeah, I think that whatever we decide that that percent is should be consistent with the variances that we can give normally. In other words, I think it's 15% variance we can give, so that variance in that section should be the same as the planning condition normally can give. That's number one. Number two is my favorite bugaboo is medical clinics and hospitals. The medical industry has changed over the years, and now doctors are expected to see a patient every 6 minutes. That's the expectation of the organizations. They want a flow through their facilities. All right, so what does that do to the parking? Right now, we're requiring one space for each 250 square feet plus one space per exam room. Exam rooms typically have one patient in them and at least two waiting in the waiting room to get into the same room, multiplied by the number of rooms. So I think that we experienced some major problems at the hospital with parking. I mean, Home Depot didn't want them parking in their parking lot, but you go over there and Home Depot parking lot ain't full of customer cars. Sansom Clinic was the other facility. We had big problems there with parking, still do. So much so that the adjacent landowner had to paint every one of his parking spots, no medical parking here. So I just think it's, like Mary said, we shouldn't reduce the parking requirements in some of these high-intensity areas, which would leave them the same as we had them, because we put them that way with a text amendment on purpose. So we ought to leave them the way we got them.
Okay. Someone on the council want to pick up on this? Councilmember Mosby.
I mean, I agree. I mean, it's understanding and owning a few parking spaces. I know what burdens they can be, and burdens for tenants by not having adequate parking for them. You want to really upset tenants, and you have tenants get into parking wars, and then they're blocking their spots. These are mine, these are yours, and you end up getting calls over stupid stuff you shouldn't be arguing about. And, you know, I mean, what else is a community assembly? Would a movie theater be considered a community assembly?
No, these would be like lodges, churches, things like that.
So a bingo hall, potentially.
Potentially. I'd have to
So,
look at the terms.
You got one space, I mean, a lodge, they play bingo there, so you have one space per 300 square foot, and you're gonna have a lot more people in there, so you're gonna have one parking place for potentially 10 people. So I mean, that impact in itself seems one of the highest, largest modifications. And I agree with Commissioner Fink that, the medical clinic component, who wants somebody to have to challenge themselves to get to the doctor? That shouldn't be the burden to fight to get there. And I think in some of the most restrictive areas that we've gotten more lenient on, you're going to create significant issues. And I guess if that's the way we go down the road, I guess we can change it again further on. How many parking amendments have you guys gone through over the years to actually increase them because they weren't intense enough?
Every time we hear a project, parking is an issue, either with variances or something else.
Councilmember Mosby, do you want to make a motion?
I'll see if somebody else wants to make one. I tried already.
Well, go ahead and try again, because I'll second it.
Well, do you have a list of the intensive parking spaces that were there? The most intense one that you felt should be kept at the highest levels? I mean, medical clinic was one that you felt.
And Mary thought that the variance of 30% by administrative was a little high, and that it should be reduced back to what the regular one is 15%, I believe.
Do you guys want to challenge any other intensive uses, like community assembly? Well, I tried. They said no. I only got a second.
As long as we're talking about it, let's talk about retail trade types. Right now, the parking is based on gross footage, square footage, and I think that it should be changed to the one space per 250 square feet of net retail floor space. Net retail floor space is much different than gross square footage in a retail establishment. You have your sales fixtures in there, you have your display cases, you have refrigeration units, storage areas, things. So where could people conceivably go? And it's in the aisles of these stores. So that's what I would change that to.
Okay, I'll add that on the motion. Anybody got anybody else?
I just want to make a comment. I'm not going to add anything to the parking because you know my opinion on parking. But
see if you can get a second on this.
I cannot possibly do that. I'm not a council member. So I guess where do we see our parking problems most? We said definitely medical, and we know that. We said obviously the variance. That's a problem. I agree with that. It should be brought down to 15%. But I also see, you were talking about retail. I drive H Street many times. I mean, all the time. And those parking lots are always empty.
Yeah, that was the purpose of the
motion. Oh, okay, so you
was,
want to actually relax that.
I want to relax it from gross square footage to retail
Sorry,
space.
I misunderstood your...
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, Councilmember Mosby, is that your motion then?
No, I'll try adding the community assembly and the restaurant back on to keep those where they are as well, if I can get a second on that.
I'll give you a second.
No, I'll go ahead and third. I know we're going to hear it again.
Okay.
Mr. Mayor?
Yes.
The city clerk is indicating that she's not clear on what the motion was. So can we? And I don't know that I am either.
Councilmember Starbuck,
can we
you
clarify
gave it a third.
that?
Tell her what it was.
Parking.
Okay, Councilmember Mosby, why don't you repeat it?
The ability for staff to go from 30% to 15%. Keep it where it is. On changing. I had keep community assembly what it is currently. Restaurant what it is currently. Retail was 250 square foot of net space, and keep medical of the number that is current.
Okay, is that what the seconder and the thirder understood?
Yes.
Okay, we're good.
Could I just add one thing? So you want to change just one area to net and as opposed to all of the code? You want the special consideration just for that use to look at net as opposed to changing all of the
Yeah,
the
I
code?
specifically said retail.
Okay, all right.
And the medical clinic would remain what it was.
And if we could, Mr. Mayor, could we go back to the, I wanted to just make sure the change in the built to line, going from 0 to 5 feet, from to 5 to 10 feet, and designing for safety. We did have consensus on that? Did I saw heads nod. Were we good? Okay, great. So I see, like, everybody nodding their head. Okay.
Any other things for discussion this evening? Good. Okay. Where's my agenda? There's my agenda. Okay, your last opportunity for oral communication. Anyone? Okay, then we will adjourn. The city council will adjourn to a closed meeting of its regular city council meeting June 5th at 6:30 p.m. at City Hall. Planning Commission will adjourn to a closed session meeting, to the regular meeting of June 13th, 2018, held at 6:30 p.m. City Hall. Thank you and good evening.